Do we have some music, the crescendo that leads up to the da-da-da-da-da?
That's all in post-production.
Okay.
All right.
Yep, we're good.
So Dad, just start us off, when and where you were born.
I was born in Athol, Massachusetts, small town in western Massachusetts, in September 22nd, 1934.
And you're just, how long did you live in Athol? Any significant childhood memories of Athol?
Didn't live in Athol very long. To my recollection of discussions of family going on, it was a short period of time because my father was from Middletown, Connecticut, and I think within a couple of months after I was born, my parents moved with me took me to Middletown, and grew up in Middletown for the next 15 years.
So take us through some of those childhood memories in Middletown.
Well, we lived in the city on Main Street. It was probably one of the widest main streets you'll see in any of the towns, small towns. And at that time, the town I think was about 30 to 40,000 population. And the main street was so wide that in the wintertime, when we had a significant snowfall, they would move the snow to the center of the street, and then the snow loader would come down and move it into the trucks to take it away. It was a mile long, and I specifically remember that because I went to St. John's Parochial School, which was the opposite end of Main Street from where we lived, and it was a mile. And I don't have a lot of sympathy for kids who take the bus every day these days, because I walked a mile in the morning to school, I walked a mile back for lunch, ate lunch quick so I could walk a mile back to school and be there for the afternoon session, and then walk a mile home that afternoon. And my father was a taxi driver in Middletown, Connecticut for 33 years. And you would think being a kid whose father was had a taxi business, had a taxi, I'd get a lot of rides to school. I can remember about 2 or 3 times, and only when it was bad weather, inclement weather, I'd get a ride to school. That was it. I enjoyed growing up in town, in Middletown, probably because I didn't know any better. I mean, I made friends. There's a university near in Middletown called Wesleyan. It's basically a liberal arts school. Has a good reputation, but we used to love to go up to Wesleyan University and go through the museum, like the Natural History Museum, and we do that rather than just run around playing in the neighborhood. And in those days, you could go out and not come back till lunchtime, or go out in the afternoon and not have to be back till dinner time, and there was no worry that you were, somebody was going to kidnap you or assault you or something. So it was a little easier time, I think, probably to grow up. And as far back as I can remember, I was always interested in airplanes. And of course, this was in during World War II. A lot of this took place. Wesleyan University had an ROTC program, Reserve Officer Training Corps program. And they had a Stearman up there, a big yellow Stearman that they'd gotten from the Navy as a display on the ground. So we used to go up there and sneak over, thought we were sneaking over the fence. They probably saw us and knew we were there, but nobody bothered to chase us away. And we'd go over and jump in the cockpit and sit there and make we were flying. But that's probably one of the things that cemented my ambition to fly airplanes, because that's as far back as I can remember. That was in the forefront of my mind, and people would ask me, what do you want to do? And I want to fly airplanes.
How old were you when you were jumping in that Stearman?
Probably 7 or 8 years old, maybe 9. They were good times. And we had a lot of fun. And I had friends around the neighborhood. Dave Walsh was one. His father was the He's commandant to the veterans home in Rocky Hill, Connecticut. And there's an interesting anecdote. I went to a Catholic school, St. John's Parochial School, and back then the teaching was that only Catholics were going to go to heaven because everybody else wasn't the true religion. And that really disturbed me. And I went home to my mother actually crying because Dave Walsh was my best friend and I knew he wasn't Catholic. Well, of course, my mother came through with some of her, what I realized later on was real wisdom. And she said, well, she said, I don't know what the sister told you, but really what probably happened that if you basically lead a good life, you will be rewarded, and God, whoever it is, however you perceive it, will take care of you. So I felt better about that after that. Another thing that happened that I remember from the school days, the sisters weren't bashful about asking you personal questions. It was early in the school year, and she was going through the list of students. And it came to me, she said, Mr. Amato, and of course, when the sister spoke to you, you were expected to stand up, get out of your seat and stand up. There's no such thing as sitting in your seat and talking to the sister. She says, Amato, that's Italian, isn't it? And I said, yes, it is, yes. And yes, sister. She said, do you speak Italian? And I said, no. And she said, why not? Well, I was stumped. I didn't know what to say because I didn't want to make her mad. That was an invitation to not a ruler, across your knuckles. So I went home, and of course, first thing when I got home, my mother, I said, the sister wants to know why I don't speak Italian. And the explanation was that my father came over from Italy. He was an immigrant. And when they came to this country, his mother and father, when they spoke to each other, they spoke in Italian. But the kids were instructed that you're an American now. You will speak English. And they said, that's what it was. He says, that's why. We never did. And then they just sort of carried on the tradition. I mean, now as you look back, it would be nice to be fluent in Italian or something. But so that was how that came about.
Can I make one change? The
Dad, now take us through the high school years. You know, your sports, what you did, high school, and then how you and Marie met. You know, take us through that whole era.
Okay, I'll start with, actually, I didn't graduate from St. John's Parochial School. I was evicted. And the story behind that was they had a program wherein after the normal school day, one day, whatever it was a week, had dancing lessons. And I was going through that stage where I didn't think much of girls. Never, you know, I didn't realize how stupid that is. But anyway, I skipped school, and then I skipped dancing lessons that day and walked home, and which is about 5-6 miles. And this was after we moved to Portland, Connecticut. And we went to school the next day, and the sister said, had a clipboard, and she says, anyone who didn't attend dancing lessons last night, stand up. Well, again, you know, when the sister said something, that was whatever they said that you did, you know. So I jumped out of my seat. I was the only one. There were some other people that skipped, but they were smart. Go see the principal. So I went to see the principal. He says, go home and don't come back. Bring one of your parents if you're going to come back. So my mother went with me. I went back. And the fallout and the whole thing was that the dancing lessons were mandatory, but you had to pay for them. So my mother said, well, you know, I don't see how you can do that. I don't see how you can make them mandatory and have to pay for them. You know, if they're voluntary to pay for, it's different. He said, well, that's the way it is. She said, okay, we're out of here. And we left. So I ended up entered school, and for the last, whatever it was, 5 or 6 months of 8th grade in Portland, where they had the 7th and 8th grade, and they had a high school. And so I started school there and continued there through high school, graduating in 1952. The way I met Marie was we double dated with another couple and went to a town called East Hampton, and I wanted to learn to square dance. And we were learning to square dance, and doing one of the roundabouts or whatever it was, I let go of Marie when I should, you know, should have held on to her, and she went flying across the room. Fortunately, she didn't fall. She bumped into somebody else, kind of cushioned her release, and that's how we met, and you know, started dating after that. Of course, she lived in the same town. Locally it was called Gildersleeve. It's part of Portland. And Portland, being a small town at that time, was probably about 15,000 people. And kind of place where they roll up the sidewalks at 9 o'clock. Not a lot going on, but a nice place nevertheless. And there's still some really beautiful old houses in Portland that were built, you know, in the 30s and so forth. And whenever we've been back there, we go through and like to see those again. It's like I say, it's a really pretty area. We both, you know, we dated and got going, went steady, and then became engaged, and then we were married in 1955, April 16th, 1955. Small wedding, St. Mary's Catholic Church there in Portland. Small reception, maybe 50 people there, if there are that many, mostly just family, a few friends. And I was in between assignments. I had completed navigator school, and I was on my way for assignment to Great Falls Air Force Base, Montana. So I think we had 2 weeks vacation or 2 weeks leave. And so we were able to squeeze a wedding and a couple of days of honeymoon, and then travel time from Portland out to Great Falls, Montana, which is another story in itself.
Yeah, so before we, because we want to talk about that, but before that, when did the Air Force, when did you say, okay, I'm gonna go sign up, I'm gonna go join the Air Force? What were you a senior, or was it?
Yeah, I was, well, actually, I was I graduated high school in 1952, and contrary to my mother's wishes, she wanted me to, go to medical school and be a doctor. I didn't cotton to that, so I went to, signed up to go to University of Connecticut, and I entered into the engineering program. I did very well in high school in math. I mean, geometry, trigonometry, I really loved doing that stuff, but when it came to calculus, I hit a brick wall. And, I kind of got concerned about that, and maybe this, I'm in the wrong, going into the wrong field. And of course, in the back of my mind was, I really don't want to go to school, I want to fly airplanes. And I don't remember how it happened, but I ended up at a recruiting center in New Haven, Connecticut, and talking to a recruiter. And I told him, I said, I want to go to pilot school, I want to become a pilot. And he said, well, you need 2 years of college minimum to get into the pilot training program. But he said, I'll tell you what, he said, I got a deal for you if you're interested. I said, well, I'm listening. And he said, you go to navigator school. Now, you only need a high school degree, a diploma. You go to navigator school, and when you get to the end of the program, they ask you what you'd like for an assignment. You tell them you want to go to pilot training. So they turn around, they send you to pilot training. And then when you come out of pilot training, now you're double rated, because at navigator school, you learn to be a navigator bombardier. Now you go to pilot school, and you learn to be a pilot. That's what's referred to as a three-headed monster. You write your own ticket. So I thought, well, where do I sign up? So that was the beginning of that phase, and I enlisted into the Aviation Cadet program in navigator school. I attended navigator school at Ellington Air Force Base in Texas, and it was a year long. And at the end of that, I was commissioned a second lieutenant reserve in the Air Force, and it gave me a badge that said I was a navigator. My first assignment was to Great Falls, Montana, which was a strategic fighter wing, which was a little bit different because strategic air forces were generally big bombers, airplanes, long range kind of operation. And it was a little different concept. And they needed a navigator to teach celestial procedures to the pilots.
So before you get into telling us about that, tell us about the trip going up. You said there's something in there about the trip going from Portland to
when I was Marie came down for my graduation from navigator school, and so we were out looking around, and we ended up looking at some house trailers, and we thought, well, geez, this is, for two people starting out, no kids and so forth, this is probably a good way to start out until we figure out where we're going to be, how long, and one thing or another. And of course, I back up a little bit. I found out when I got to the end of navigator school, and I told them I wanted to go to pilot training, and they said, okay, we'll put that down on your request list. Meanwhile, plan to go to Great Falls, Montana, and because that's where you're right now. That's where you're assigned. So okay. And long story short, sort of, we decided to buy a trailer, and it was manufactured in Elkhart, Indiana. And so that would work out good. We'll go home, we'll get married, we'll drive to Elkhart, pick up the trailer, and pull up to Great Falls, Montana. So okay, that's a great plan. And so, as I said earlier, we got married. I think we went on a 2-day honeymoon or something like that, and then went home and packed up the car and headed for Elkhart, Indiana. And it was the car was a 1950 Chevrolet slantback and a fastback, and nice little car that Marie had purchased when she was before we were married. She was working at Pratt & Whitney up in East Hartford, and she bought the car and it was hers. And so anyway, that's what we had for transportation, and I headed out to Elkhart, Indiana. Stopped there at the factory, and went in and said, we're here to pick up our trailer. The guy said, okay, and he says, it's sign this piece of paper, and it's the outside on the ramp next to the factory. He said, it's the whatever, the 6th trailer down from the end. He said, that's yours. So we went out there and drove up to this thing, and I figured, well, I'll back the car up to the trailer, and they'll hook it up, and away we go. So I backed it up, and the guy came over, and he's looking in the back of the car and says, where's your hitch? And I said, what are you talking about? And he said, well, you got to have a hitch to tow the trailer. And I said, it doesn't come with the trailer? He goes, oh no. He said, that's extra, that's all yours, all on you. So then we got to go someplace in town, find somebody to buy a hitch from and install it. And of course, we started all this, got married and started all this. We didn't have a lot of money in the bank or anything like that. So we were on a limited income or limited expenditures. And that kind of depleted our expenditures, our kitty. And he got a trailer, got a hitch, got it installed. Now this was a 32-foot trailer, 8 foot wide. And pulling, in retrospect, it was really stupid trying to pull it with that 1950 Chevrolet. And there's a couple of indicators that confirmed that. Was like the fact that by the time we got to Great Falls, Montana, the rear tires on that Chevrolet were bald. And that was from pulling the trailer and going through the mountains up in Colorado and the Dakotas and so forth. The side crosswinds that are blowing. It was commonplace. The highways out there are cut through a lot of the mountain ridges and so forth. And so as you're going like through the valley area, the winds are coming down crosswise to the crosswind to the road, and so you got all this wind pushing against the trailer, and it's trying to push the trailer downwind, and the car is actually kind of getting sideways with the effort of the wind. And then you'd get into the area that was, once you get into where the peaks were in between the hills, there was a lack of wind because of the wind, the hill there, the landscape. So all of a sudden, all this correction you were holding in to try and keep this thing from going off the road, all of a sudden you headed to the other side of the road because of all of a sudden the wind disappeared. And so it was a learning experience, even though I'd gotten some good tips from Marie's dad, who was a truck driver. Basically, he delivered bulk oil and drove a tanker truck. So he gave me some good tips before we left out about pulling trailers. We got to Kansas and went from Kansas across, I guess it was the Mississippi River and Missouri River, one or the other, into Missouri, or maybe it was Missouri into Kansas. And you had to stop at a weigh station, and they wanted to see if you had, make sure you had insurance on the trailer before you could pull it across their state. And the guy asked me for the insurance, and I showed him my car insurance, which I had checked with the company that insured the car, and they said, yeah, the trailer would be insured too, but they didn't give me anything in writing to show that. And so, because coincidentally, they wouldn't accept that. They wouldn't accept my word. And it just was, kind of thing where, well, today's your lucky day because we just happen to sell insurance here. And for whatever it was, when I already was telling you, we were low, the kitty was kind of low, so I couldn't afford to buy a policy. So we get back in the car and back over the bridge, back into the state we came from, and went about 50 miles up the road and crossed the river and headed across, I think it was going through Kansas. And it was, I remember the area was Leavenworth, because anytime, at least I did, you hear Leavenworth, you think of a prison there, a federal prison. And it was funny because we'd be driving along and you'd see a police car, a highway patrol car, and Marie would slink down on the seat. She was worried somehow they were going to see and stop us and find out that we're illegally traveling across their state. Pretty much after that, it was, things kind of settled down. We got to Great Falls without any further event and set the trailer up there. was interesting being in Great Falls because they get some of the coldest weather up there. The city of Great Falls sets down in a bowl sort of depression, and there's actually a difference like of 700-foot elevation between the center Main Street of Great Falls downtown and the municipal airport, which is like within 5 miles of the downtown. In fact, in the wintertime, people would go in a cold spell, and the air would settle in the city. People would go out of the city and go up to the airport and park up there and sit in the sunshine because it was like 30 or 40 degrees warmer being up out of that bowl. And so cold air does sink, it does settle to the lower areas, true. Yeah, that's we kept that trailer for I think 2 years or something, and then we upgraded it to a little nicer unit, and I think it was a 10-foot wide, a Mayflower, and we enjoyed our time there. It's a great area for nature. We used to pack a lunch and 5 gallon of gasoline, put it in the trunk, and just head out, and there's all kinds of logging roads through the backwoods up there, and it was amazing what you'd see, particularly animals, and we saw foxes and bears and antelope and things like animals, and really, I mean, it was the weather was extreme in many instances, but and then another interesting thing was that the weather, the climate, or the type of weather it was a very dry cold. So unless the wind was blowing, you could be outside on a 0 day and it'd feel like somewhere else, like 30 or 40 degrees, and like in the east where it's more humid or something. We enjoyed the time we were there. We got to visit the Glacier National Park. Went all through that area up there, which is unparalleled in the beauty and nature. And our first 3 children were born there. Pardon?
Great Falls, man.
Yeah, in Great Falls.
How long were you there?
We got there in 1955, and then left Great Falls in 1959 to go to pilot training. They finally honored my request 4 years later.
So
as I say, it was good to us.
Tell us a little bit about now that 4-year period of like what you did in the Air Force at that time, and how that worked and played into having 3 kids through that whole thing and living in that trailer.
Yeah, my job was, and I wondered about it because years I was brand new, as I say, gold bar second lieutenant, and I was assigned to a fighter squadron. I knew nothing about it. I didn't, no such thing as going to Google and Google and find out what the deal was with it. But what it was, it's the Strategic Air Command, in its infinite wisdom, decided they needed some more punch, I guess you might put it that way, in their attack strategy. Normally, their mission was to utilize heavy bombers to conduct any kind of operation. This was a departure from that philosophy, and these were fighters. And specifically, when we arrived at Great Falls Air Force Base, which is what it was known as at that time, the squadron I was assigned to, or the wing actually, were flying F-84Gs, which was built by Republic. It's a straight wing fighter with tip tanks, and they were converting to F-84Fs, which is a swept wing design. So it was faster, heavier, carried more armament. Carried an external nuclear weapon, and the idea was to, in the event we went to war with our most probable enemy, which was Russia, The fighters, when launched, would fly over the North Pole and into Russia to hit their targets. Well, there weren't any nav aids going particularly over the North Pole. There's no nav aids around the nav aids around the ice cap. And so they had to resort to celestial navigation, which is taking so-called star shots, sun or star shots, with a sextant. And first of all, there's a problem with that in that when you're attempting to take a star shot, you need to take it from a stabilized platform position. And in order to do this, the airplane had to have an autopilot. So because it generally requires both hand operation to operate in a sextant. Well, the F-84Fs that the SAC had gotten, they got from Tactical Air Command, and Tactical Air Command never saw any need to have a autopilot in the airplane. Most of their missions in a tactical operation were like average an hour and a half long, so they didn't need an autopilot. Nevertheless, the requirement was there for these guys to learn the celestial navigation. And so you've got 4 first lieutenants and captains who've been around for a number of years, and they were fighter pilots for sure. They thought navigators were some kind of extraneous that they didn't need to have anything to do with. So the only reason they tolerated me was because it was a requirement to fill the square to accomplish that training. And so they learned to do celestial navigation. And in the meantime, the powers that be changed their mind again and said, well, we don't really need these fighters anymore. And I think this was probably when the missiles started coming into play and the nuclear submarines. So the fighters were, the organization was disbanded, and they got rid of the fighters, and I was assigned to work in personnel at the wing level while awaiting, because I was frozen to the base because I made an application to go to pilot training. So that kept me from being reassigned somewhere else. And the result, things happen the way they happen, but in a general sense, I look back at it, and I think Marie would agree if she were here. It was good. Life was good to us. The Air Force was good. We were together. We weren't separated. We started our family there. Steve, Greg, and Jean were all born in Great Falls. We enjoyed the area. We got to see a lot of the surrounding countryside. And it really is, I think it's like with the guy, Huntley and Brinkley, it's one of those guys, or both of them had property out there, and they referred to as Big Sky Country. It really is. It's a beautiful area. So we had good experiences there. I mean, I wished I'd gone to pilot training a little bit earlier, but that's one of the things you look back and with 20/20 hindsight say, well, if I'd done this or I could have done that, it'd have been better. But it was good to us, and we left there in 1959. I finally got a class in pilot training. We had our trailer. We didn't tow the trailer this time. We did learn something, especially a 10-foot trailer, 10-foot wide. I mean, this one was 40 feet instead of 32. It was a little bit larger. So it was a commercial tower, towed it down to Florida, and we went to a training station here in northern Florida, and I'm trying to think what the name of the base was down there. Maybe it'll come to me later on, but it was a primary training base. And
Pensacola?
No, it wasn't Pensacola. That's Navy. That's strictly Navy. Like I say, it'll probably come to me later on in the mental block about it. We made it to Florida. The kids by this time Steve was born in 56, Greg was 57, Jean was 58, so Jean was a year and a half old, and Steve was 3 years old. And this thing that popped into my mind as we go along here, one of the things that sticks in my mind about Greenham Air Base. That was the name of the that's a civilian field, northwestern Florida. It's located near Marianna, Florida. And we get a call one day at the trailer, it's the main gate at Greenham Air Base, and they said, we got a little boy up here who's told us his name is Greg Amato. Do you have a son, a little kid named Greg Amato? Yes. Of course, became very, Marie was home, of course, I was on duty at work, became very alarmed, and it's like when a police officer called it. And what had happened was Greg got in his little wagon and decided he was going to go exploring. So he's headed down the road to the main gate and he's going to take off. And fortunately, the guards were there to stop him and went and picked him up. So again, it was a nice time. Enjoyed the training. I started out in primary there flying the T-34 trainer, single engine, still straight wing, light airplane, and tandem seating, one in front, one back, built by Beach Aircraft, which builds really good, strong airplanes. My first, what they call a dollar ride, they take you out and just show you the area and tell you, give you some tips on flying around the local area. And I had an instructor, a guy from the instructor was an older gentleman, receding hairline, but really nice guy. And he was in the back seat, I was in the front seat, and we were out flying around, and he was showing me all these little auxiliary fields where you would go out and practice touch and go landings as part of the curriculum. And he said, now, see this field over here? And he pointed it out to me. I said, yes, sir. And he said, well, we're going to go over there and we're going to do a touch and go. So he started the approach to it. He got out on I guess it was downwind. And maybe it was base leg because he kind of abbreviated the approach. So as he turned final approach, it looked like we were going to be a little bit short, so he went to add some power. Well, the engine coughed, and he backed off with the throttle, and he tried again. Each time he tried it, like it wasn't going to work. So now that the situation, all of a sudden, everybody's muscles kind of tightened a little bit. Oops! And he stretched it, and we made it to the end of the runway, just barely made it and touched down. And taxi went off to the side and shut down. He called the base and told them that they needed somebody to come over with a mechanic because the engine wasn't running right. And I'm sitting there thinking, wow, what's the big deal? And he was apologizing. He said, now, don't get upset. I don't want you. I hope you're not, didn't scare you or anything like that. He says, it's just an unusual thing, and it brings up a good point when you're making your plan for the approach, because you used to do, as you're familiar with flight airplanes, you do a power off approach, and so you always got to make sure that if it doesn't work out, that you can still make it. And it's always like having a little plus in your back pocket. And I was sitting there thinking, what the hell is he talking about? I mean, we're flying, right? That's all I want to do, is fly. So, and never had any other incidents after that. The airplanes always worked the way they were supposed to work. I enjoyed flying the T-34, and then I went to the T-28, which was a much bigger airplane. Had a 600 horsepower engine in it, two-bladed prop. And another funny, humorous incident. I guess we were flying the T-28 with the instructor, and of course the airplanes have what's called a relief tube in it, and it's just a little rubber hose, and it's got a little cone at one end, like a male urinal, and that's what it is. If you got to pee, you use that, you pee to that, and it goes down the tube and out into the open air. And I remember this one particular training flight, and he said, the instructor, he says, just hold it straight and level. It was my big chance to mess him up. He says, now hold it straight and level. He says, I gotta use the how they call it, the tube. He said, I gotta use the tube here to pee. And I hear him back there cussing, And he says, I can barely get it up off the floor, I can't reach it. And I can't get it up to where, you gotta hold it down here and kind of aim and pee into it. So he ended up peeing all over his hand or something. So when we got back to base and landed and taxied up, and of course the mechanic would come over, and if he'd plug into the intercom, and the first question was, is the airplane okay? Because it had to be rotated and that someone else was gonna take it out for another mission. And the instructor says, yeah.
Can we stop for a second? Card filled up.
That's okay, because Bella's been waiting for a couple minutes.
That's a good story though. It sucks that I just stopped right there.
Yeah, it's good to see.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, let's
How much you got on your card, Joe?
42 minutes of recording.
Yeah, probably now.
Do I need to back up a little bit so they overlap?
Yeah,
Yeah.
Yeah, just go to, you pulled up and the mechanic plugged in.
Okay.
Yeah, that intercom.
So we landed and taxied in, and the mechanic comes up, plugs in the intercom and to check and see the status of the airplane, and the instructor said there's something with the relief, it was called a relief tube. The relief tube, he said, I had to use it, he said, and it's too short. And there was this moment of silence, and then the crew chief says, are you sure that's what too short, sir? The instructor didn't take kindly to that comment. And I'm sitting up there like this. But, little things like that add a little humor to what could be stressful situations when you're out trying to fly or make the fly the way you're being instructed or expected to. Little moments like that broke it up. And little things that stick with you as interesting escapades.
How long were you there?
Pardon?
How long were you there?
Primary was, in my recollection, was 3 months. And you ended up with about 60 hours of flying time.
Just those two aircrafts?
I'm sorry?
Just the two aircrafts? The two beaches?
Yeah, just the two. At that time, the next training level was called basic, which the Air Force had been doing the training when the T-33s, which was the Lockheed F-80, was one of the early jets, probably one of the first jet fighters, but it was a two-seat version instead of single. Controls in both cockpits. At that time, the Air Force was upgrading or transitioning to a newer trainer called a T-37, which was built by Cessna. It was a little smaller airplane, straight wing, and a side-by-side seating. So you had an instructor on one side, which was thought to me, and I think probably was a valid point. It was easier when instructing to, you can see what the guy's doing rather than front seat, back seat, you know what the hell's going on and what the student's doing. And but I was one of the last training groups, or one of the last groups in training to go through the T-33, which was the pros and cons. I always like to go into, like going into a new car. I'd like to have a new car rather than the old one. But T-33 was a pretty reliable airplane. It had the older engine. It was underpowered. It had the old centrifugal flow engine, which basically had one big turbine at the beginning of it, bringing all the air in back into the engine instead of the later axial flow, which has a smaller diameter turbine, but hundreds of blades, thereby increasing the volume and the efficiency of air going into the engine and the result in more power. But went to from Marietta, we went to Craig Air Force Base, which was down in Selma, Alabama. Now, what do you remember about Selma? People like a favorite place for people like who's this guy that's out in Ferguson now? Yeah, well, they had some of the early civil rights marches down there in Selma, which was an interesting time. And that was actually after we were there, but Selma's a typically southern, you know, Alabama town. And, you know, I was talking, I don't know who I was talking to recently, this goes back now, if I may, to when I first went to training in navigator school, and it was at Ellington, which is not too far from Houston. And on a few occasions when you got time off and you get off base, I went downtown and I went to take a bus, and I got on the bus, and for whatever reason I just walked all the way to the back of the bus and sat down. And I'm sitting there and looking around, and I noticed that the bus is not moving. So I kind of finally look up front, and the driver's sitting there looking in the rear view mirror, and he's going to me, he's motioning like this. So yeah. So I get up out of my seat and I head up towards the bus driver. He says, "You sit up here," and he motioned like up in the middle part of the bus. So that was the days when, you know, black people sat in the back of the bus, and the white people sat up front. And which was interesting. And you know, I kind of use that as to how, you know, people say, well, things haven't changed much. Well, they have. I mean, the black people don't sit in the back of the bus anymore, at least not unless that I'm aware of. I thought about that after that, and I was very careful, and you became aware of your surroundings and what you were doing, and became informed about local customs, because it was the way to go. So anyway, back to basic training in the T-33s at Craig Air Force Base, and had two things that stick out in my mind with that. One thing was I had an instructor who was I didn't have him as my primary instructor. He was kind of a fill-in for whatever reason on a particular time on this particular training session went on. And he was a frustrated fighter pilot. He'd been in Europe and flown fighters or whatever group over there, and came back and was assigned as an instructor. Didn't really want to be there, at least was my perception of his attitude. But nevertheless, he was a good instructor. But his favorite training tactic was to fly in the afternoon, because in the afternoon there were more frequently buildups around the area because of the heat causing the buildups to occur. And you pick out a buildup and you put the throttle full at max speed as fast as the airplane would go, and then you try and gauge at just the right moment. You pull up and you go vertical. And the whole idea was to fly to that buildup, fly up one side, roll over the airplane, fly across the top, and then come down the other side. And at first I thought he was kind of nutty, but then he said, you know, he pointed out all the different skills you had to develop to do that and do it properly. And once I got the hang of it, you know, it was a lot of fun. I mean, you know, we talk about crowded airspace. I mean, there was limits to the size of the training area, so there's all these students out there flying around these airplanes, and it was, now I mean, I look back on it now, I probably wouldn't do that because too much of a risk of running into somebody. But fortunately, we didn't, that never happened. And I don't ever remember anybody having from the training squadron ever having a mid-air. So it worked out. The other thing was we were doing formation training, and that was something I really, really enjoyed. And now the guy I talked earlier about mentioned his name, Jim Kelly. He washed out of pilot training because he was just too apprehensive, anxiety-ridden about flying close to another airplane. He was training when he was in SAC or what, but because with the big bombers, you never got close to anybody else. You had to have 500-foot separation and a couple of miles and all that kind of thing. But I loved formation, and the tighter the formation, the better. And I remember we were in a 3-ship formation. I was number 2 guy, and the guys in the lead ship were trying to shake us, or shake me and the 3rd ship, and I just kept tucking up closer and closer in his tail position, and down below and slight behind. Matter of fact, at one point, when he rolled over in one direction, the sun was shining up the tailpipe, and I'm sitting there and I could count the blades on the compressor, the jet engine and the exhaust, and I was probably a little closer than I should have been. My nose was probably tucked up around the end. And so then at the last moment, he decided, kind of a dirty trick, he popped the speed brake. And of course I popped my speed brake and I went down a little bit, so because I knew I was going to creep up on him. And the guy behind me, he in fact had my full-time instructor was in the 3rd ship with a student. And all of a sudden I looked out to the left and he was out over here looking at me. Well, we came back and landed, and the instructor in the lead ship couldn't believe that he couldn't shake me off the airplane, off his tail. And the guy, my instructor says, "You're lucky he didn't knock you out of the sky." He said, he was close enough to open the cockpit or the canopy if you read something about your airplane. And it was probably pretty true. You know, it's one of those things you go, "Thank you." But got through basic training, and my primary instructor said, "Why don't you apply to stay on as an instructor?" And okay, I guess I could do that. I mean, I pictured myself as, going somewhere and flying fighter somewhere, kind of a new airplane or something, new addition. And as it turned out, I wasn't the top guy, anywhere near the top guy in the class. The guy that got the instructor assignment was much higher to the top of the class, so he got his first choice. So I got assigned to Columbus, Ohio, in B-47s as a co-pilot. And this time we made the trip a little bit more comfortable position. We had three children by then, so.
Can we take a quick break?
Sure. Don't have to pull the trailer.
Hang on one sec. This is good?
Yep. It's the numbers at the top are rolling, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
I'm trying to collect my thoughts here for a minute.
Let me ask you a question before we get
Okay.
on the way to Columbus. So when you finished in the T-33 was the last trainer plane, right? Is that like, do you get wings when you graduate? Do you graduate there at that Grissom Air Force Base, wherever you were?
Gregg Air Force Base.
Gregg Air Force
Somewhere.
Base. That's where you got your wings?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah. And it's I guess it's probably a general rule. It's probably in life in general, but particularly in aviation. Just when you, just another incident popped into my mind. When you think you're getting to be a pretty hotshot guy, a pilot, something happens that kind of brings you down a peg or two, and you realize you're not necessarily God's gift to aviation. But towards the end of the program, and you filled all your squares, other than the amount of flying time you had to complete, they just give you an airplane and say, what in the local area for an hour and a half, and fly around, do whatever you want to do. And I went out this one time in that circumstance and got into the airplane and took off, and aerobatics and formation flying were my favorite activities as far as flying. And so I got the airplane going vertical, and as the speed slowed down, going straight up, all of a sudden the cockpit filled with smoke and fumes. And right away, your heart kind of stops. You're, oh shit, I'm on fire. And got to pull over and got straight and level and try to see what was going on. And took a couple of minutes trying to figure out what was happening. And the airplane kind of, I've always been a believer as a pilot that if you listen, the airplane talks to you. So the airplane, I think, was trying to tell me something, and what it was normally when you went out the training flights, you had internal fuel in the internal fuel tank, and you had the tip tanks were half full. Most of the time you didn't need any more than that. Well, for some reason this airplane this day had full tip tanks, and I overlooked that fact. So you weren't supposed to do most of the aerobatics with at least half tips are empty. So I had these tip tanks out there where it had a lot more fuel in it, it should have. And it ended up being, that's probably one of the reasons they didn't want you to do it, because it found its way into the air conditioning system. So, like I say, just when you thought you, like that sheet of do's and don'ts, it says, don't ever relax because you probably missed something. Well, that's where that applies. So, where were we?
Okay, so you graduate. Is there an actual graduation at Greg's Air Force Base?
Yeah, well, they do a get together, and all the dignitaries are there, and then the commandant and so forth, and we'll present the wings and the declaration that's a certification, a certificate that you're a rated Air Force pilot, and that was it. Everybody shakes hands and thanks everybody, the instructors they didn't like and didn't get along with or something. Everybody's leaves on friendly terms, and you head down the road to your next assignment. It'd be interesting to see what it's like now with the increases and differences in technology. I was kind of, relatively speaking, I was kind of in the Stone Age, but then again I was way ahead of Eddie Rickenbacker and guys like that, flying SPADs and all that sort of thing, where people actually drove up, flew up next to somebody and pulled out a pistol and shot at them. That was air-to-air combat. Yeah. But
all right. So now take us through your trip to Columbus and your first start in the B-47s.
I was trying to remember I think we sold the trailer in Florida, because then when we went to, I think, I'm not to remember, I wish Marie was here to help me. When we got to Columbus, we bought a house, and I figured we were going to be there for at least 5 years. And there was Columbus was the assignment, was the Lockwood Air Force Base, which had EB-47s, which stands for electronic B-47s. They were electronic countermeasures airplanes. They were equipped with equipment to jam enemy radar and communications. The normal B-47 had a 3-man crew, was a pilot, navigator, and a co-pilot. The EB-47s had the pilot, navigator, and a co-pilot, plus 2 ECM operators. The B-47 was initially designed as a bomber and was supposed to be like a 125,000 pound, 150,000 pound gross takeoff airplane, and by the time SAC got through with add-ons, it was almost double that. So on a B-47 that was loaded to go to war, it couldn't get off the ground on its own power, so that's why they had these. They had a rack that attached to the underside of the airplane back near the tail, with like 36 JATO bottles on it. And you get going down the runway, and once you decided that you were going to go, everything was going to go, you fired those bottles, because there was no such thing as stopping. If you fired those bottles and a couple engines quit, you were going to go off the end of the runway in one big blaze of glory. But Anyway, the EB-47, they took the bomber and stripped the bomb bay and inserted a habitable capsule in there, which contained all the electronic equipment and ejection seats for the two ECM operators. And for takeoff and landing, the ejection seats in the bomb bay or the capsule area were downward ejection seats. So somebody figured out that that wasn't a good place to be if you had a sudden problem right after takeoff and you had to abandon the airplane. So for takeoff and landing, the ECM operators would crouch down in the aisle in the main cabin of the control cockpit of the B-47. And then at 2,000 or 3,000 feet, they would crawl through a tube that led to back to the bomb bay and get in the capsule and seal it, close the door, and pressurize it. And of course, had everything there, pressurization, of course, and heating and so forth, and operate the electronic equipment. And we used to fly around and practice jamming. Usually, we tried to jam Air Force radar. On more than one occasion, we jammed other radar, and I was trying to remember what the call sign was. I think it was Big Photo. Every once in a while on guard channel, you'd hear approach control going, big photo, cease buzzer, cease buzzer. Now that meant turn off your jammer because you're jamming our radar. A thing called Chaff, which is little strips of aluminum, raises havoc with a radar return. Now, I don't know about current technology. It may be something that's wired in here now that discounts that. But back in those days, and this was in the 60s, and the most effective kind of chaff was called rope chaff, which was like woven. These strips were in a piece of a piece of rope woven, and when the ECM operators detected a radar trying to acquire the airplane, the target, you'd dispense some of that chaff, and then they wouldn't be able to see. It would disappear behind all the presentation on the radar scope. It would effectively hide the airplane. And we would go through before takeoff on one of these practice missions. There was normal or actual real chaff, so to speak, that you would use in a hostile situation action. Then there was, for practice mission, there was practice chaff, and the practice chaff was just the little strips that would blow out would expel out into the slipstream, and would indicate that you had expended it. We had a procedure. Eventually, it got to I'll back up a little bit. There was a situation that happened where an airplane dispensed rope chaff over Atlanta, and it blew out, powered, I don't know how many thousands of homes, because it went down and braked over power lines, and the areas, what do you call it, where every once in a while you drive around, you see the transformers off the side of the road, or distributor, whatever you call it, and everything. Pardon?
The power stations?
Yeah, well, yeah, the outlying power station, but I mean, it was all over the national news and this and that and the other. Of course, they were looking for somebody to blame for it and so on. And I think the government paid out a lot of money because blew out a lot of TV stations and radio stations and whatnot, and of course it caused power failures. So we ended up, after that, we had to, before the mission, somebody had to crawl up in the back of the airplane. After the guys who installed it, somebody else, an independent, a member of the crew, had to crawl up there and check and make sure it was practice chaff, and then somebody had to sign an affidavit. Yeah, it is actually practice chaff. There's a lot of little things that come to my mind along the same line. Maybe I should stick back with going to Columbus. We got up there and we eventually did buy a house and lived in town. Columbus is a great town. It's a university town. Ohio State University is there. So if you want to see college sports, it was right. Doesn't get much better than Ohio State. It was probably a little bit before Woody Hayes' time, or maybe he was, not upcoming at that time. A lot to do there, a lot to see, and sort of middle America. And we enjoyed being there. It was, we had a nice, modest house, lived in it, a tri-level. I think the kids probably had good memories of that.
Was Donna born yet?
I'm sorry?
Donna? Was she born yet at this point?
Donna?
Mhm.
No.
Oh.
No, I was just about to say that's where Donna was conceived.
Oh.
So,
How
yeah.
long were you in Ohio?
1960 to 1965, 5 years. Now, interestingly, backing up, talking about traveling, Jean was 10 days old when we left Great Falls, Montana to go to Florida. I don't know if she ever was made aware of that or realized it in our talks about back in those days, but you know, it was no such thing as, well, I'm not ready, I can't this, that, and the other. I mean, it was, you had to be there. And, you know, if it was either we go together or I'd have to show up and leave Marie with, I mean, it was bad enough. We had 3 children in diapers at the same time. And I'm off flying around the country, you know, my government issued airplane. So that was an interesting point. We were at Columbus. It was a good experience again in the B-47s. The things I remember about Columbus, besides living there, there was a refueling wing also, air refueling the KC-97 tankers, and the normal work schedule was at least once a month you were on alert, which means you went out to the base and you lived in the alert facility, which was like a self-sufficient entity with all its own cooking, facility, living, just basically like a big hotel. And you're on alert, and it was to be expected. At least 2 or 3 times you'd have practice alerts and the klaxon to go off, and you run to the airplane and jump into the cockpit and stand by for further instructions. It was an interesting time. You know, the Cold War was at its ratcheting up to its higher levels, because I was there during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I can remember sitting in the airplane for 1.6 or 8 hours at a time. You know, all we do is start up the ground generator and start the engines, and away we went. I advanced in my job status, I guess. I was nominated and accepted a position to the standardization board, which is the guys that go around and check the line troops and make sure they're doing things the way they're supposed to be done as far as flying. And then generally the co-pilot was given the task of one of the requirements each year in your flight check was you had to go out and take on a full load of fuel from a tanker. And they hadn't gotten enough KC-135s at that point. In fact, I think the 135s were sort of reserved for the B-52, so we still had the KC-97. Well, the KC-97, if it's fully loaded with fuel, it's probably not going to get much above 25,000 feet in altitude. And it's not going to go that fast. So now you got a B-47 that's normally operating up in the 30,000s, got to come down to about 25,000 or so and slow down and load up with fuel, and it was a bad combination. And we did lose an airplane and a crew, but I'm getting ahead of myself. As I started to say, generally the task, primary task, one of the primary tasks for the co-pilot was to go out on these max offload fuel missions, and you just sit down in the aisle while, because there weren't any other seats, and while they refueled in the tanker. And I often thought about that because some of the instances got pretty interesting. I mean, you got an airplane that's really slow, and I mean, to the point where you can see a guy there and he's going stop to stop at the controls, and nothing's happening. The airplane's so you know you're in that twilight zone where a little bit slower, and it's going to be, you know, as they say, pull back and you go up, and pull back some more and you go down, and it's a helpless feeling because you don't have any control. You know, it's like being a passenger on an airplane. Everything's dependent on the guy who's at the controls. We did lose an airplane down over Kentucky. With that exact situation, guy got too slow and dropped off on a wing. One wing stalled, and the airplane rolled over all the way around and ended up coming down at this very steep angle. And it was a layer of clouds that obscured the ground, and probably at I don't remember exactly what altitude, but at some altitude he came through that layer and saw the ground, and decided that he needed to do everything he could to try and pull it out. And he pulled back so hard on the controls that the engines came off the wings. And of course, then the airplane started to break up. And I think one guy got out of that airplane, and I don't think it was the guy who was observing. One of the guys with the ejection, maybe it was a navigator. But a little bit of dark humor associated with that, because as they went around looking for airplane parts, this was kind of the backwoods of this area of Kentucky where this happened. And it's one guy was in the outhouse when this thing came down, and an engine landed not too far, knocked the outhouse over with him in it, and he was pretty upset, to say the least. And then there was another lady who was a witness that she kind of saw this flash in the sky. Of course, it was like I say, overcast cloud deck, and then she sees this flaming debris coming down out of the clouds, and she thought it was the end of the earth coming, the end of the world. So she's down on her knees, praying and making her last request. And I say dark humor, but you always, there's always something. It's like things that happen in your workforce, in your work environment, and in the case of loss of life, it's tragic and it's sad. But then there's generally a kind of a lighter side to it. You don't even want to acknowledge it because of the gravity of the situation, but it's there. And so it was. I liked flying formation. That's basically what you were doing with the tanker. And eventually, the way it worked out was to try and make this work better. The KC-97 would climb to whatever altitude, as much as he'd get altitude, he'd get say 20,000 feet with his full load, and you'd hook up. And then once he started offloading fuel, he would go faster because he'd have high power settings on, but he'd also do a gradual descent, so he's able to pick up a little speed then and keep the B-47 a little further away from ahead of the stall speed. But that was, you had to connect, you had to stay connected, you couldn't disconnect. Now you stay connected, and let's say you had a 2,000 or 3,000 foot layer that you could play with. So if you started out at 20,000 and you gradually descended to 17,000, now you had to stop transferring fuel, and both of you had to climb back up to 20,000. So you got to stay connected all this time, and then you start all over again. You start pumping the fuel and descending with a higher speed. Eventually it catches up with you because once you start climbing, now that the KC-97 slows down and the B-47 to stay connected has to slow down too. So it was a thing of diminishing returns. You couldn't do that indefinitely. But it was a way around the speed problem. Once you got the KC-135, there wasn't any problem. You could go balls out and connect up, and they pump fuel into you all day long. You never had a problem, and you were usually up at 35,000 feet or so, so you get a lot of speed.
So how many of those did you have to do, would you say, in your 5 years there?
How many flight checks?
Refuels. Yeah.
Refuelings, well, you had to do the one for to maintain your qualification every year, the combat ready crew, remember? But every once in a while, they'd have a national or a countrywide exercise, which would encompass the whole country. And we'd take off out of Lockbourne, and I remember we flew to somewhere up in the northwest, Seattle or wherever, and then we flew down all the way down the west coast, and then across the southern border, back down over into I think Mississippi, Louisiana, and then came up north. And I think we refueled the 2 refuelings during that, 2 or 3 refuelings, and the total mission ended up being about 17 hours, all told. But that was a good exercise to prepare you for what would happen if you actually had to go in a hostile situation. You know, in other words, we went to war. It was going to be a long mission. Probably ended up being a one-way mission, but it was a long mission. It wasn't any 2 or 3 hour thing. And we did that at least once a year. Once a year, the guys from headquarters at SAC would come in, and you'd have a practice session where you'd go through the whole thing. Everybody be called out to the base. Everybody be on alert. And they'd have to launch the airplanes and launch at 15-second intervals, which was interesting. I was surprised you didn't lose more airplanes to wake turbulence, because that's pretty dangerous when you're close to the ground. But then again, you know, the wake off an airplane generally goes down, because it comes off the wings and goes down. And so if it goes down, you're closer to the ground, it disperses, whereas if you're up in the air somewhere, it's just going to continue down in its downward movement. And if you happen to catch it at an altitude fairly close to what the airplane is causing the wake, it can give you some real problems with control problems. But anyway, I don't remember a specific number, but it was not unusual to have say 3 or 4 of those a year. Yeah.
And when did you? It was during your time there at Columbus. You transferred from co-pilot to pilot.
Towards the end of it, I was upgraded to aircraft commander, and then the wing was trying to think if the wing was being disbanded. The EB-47s, I think so. And I'd received my assignment to Clark Air Base. Well, originally they were going to assign me to Air Force Headquarters. Were going to assign me to B-52s at Amarillo Air Force Base. And of course, you know how it is in any organization. The scuttlebutt. You know, you tell somebody, if somebody finds out that you've got an assignment to someplace and they're going to have some comment about it, you know, it's a great place to go, or it's a shithole. And they said, the thing they said about Amarillo was, well, you can be 2 feet deep in snow, fall on your face, and get sand in your mouth. So, and I wasn't crazy about being in B-52s. I was really ready for a change, and that sounds. Maybe that sounds a little over the top or arrogant or something, but I guess it's sort of like a career change in whatever field you're in, or to some degree. I wanted to get into something different. I was tired of flying straight and level. In fact, I applied for U2s, and I went down and had the interview for the U2 program, and they told me that they thought I was qualified and everything, except I was too tall. If I had to eject out of the U2, I'd lose my kneecaps, both kneecaps. And they said it's kind of hard to escape and evade back to your own lines when you don't have any kneecaps. I'm not sure there was I think it was a very selective program. It's just like the astronaut, not to that degree, but it was sort of like the astronaut. They had enough people applying for it. They could be very, very selective. So it was probably something in my portfolio that they didn't particularly care for.
Okay. Let's break there.
Yeah.
Hey, with Columbus, any other thoughts you have there? Okay.
Yeah, part of the mission at Columbus was a thing called Reflex, and we would fly to the B-47 to a place north of London, about an hour north of London, called Greenham Common, and land over there, and we would be on alert there for a week, and with all the alert rules and requirements. Excuse me. And then we'd have a week off, and then we'd go on alert for a week again, and then we'd rotate back to Columbus, Ohio. And that was a normal operation, dispersing the aircraft. SAC was Strategic Air Command specifically, dispersing the aircraft around different bases around the world. The idea was so you would be concentrated in one place. That's the idea, basic idea with the airborne alert, so you wouldn't catch the airplanes on the ground. You know, if they launched an airstrike or missiles from land-based missiles or submarine, if you catch all the enemy's airplanes on the ground, it's a lot easier to destroy them. And then there was, like the Cuban Missile Crisis, I think there's 4 levels of what's called DEFCON, defense condition. And I think it's 4, 3, 2, 1. Well, 1 is get ready because the president may push the button any moment. And I think we went to I don't know if we went to 1. I know we went to DEFCON 2 with the Cuban Missile Crisis. May have gone to 1 because we were out in the airplanes ready to go. We were there, and like I think at one particular point we spent, and it was right around the time when the ships carrying the missiles were intercepted by the U.S. Navy. They didn't know what was going to happen, and so I wanted everybody to be ready. But part of that operation, a certain number of the airplanes in our squadron were dispersed, and 3 or 4 of them went to civilian field, Syracuse Municipal Airport, and landed there. So they were there and staging from there. So.
And what did you have on those planes when you were staging? What were you carrying?
They were ECM. So
you were still countermeasures.
Yeah, we're still counting. We were always countermeasures. I was never in the bombers. Didn't get in any bombers until I got to Clark.
Can we just get you to put the glass down?
Oh, okay. Sorry about that.
You can hear it.
Well, that's really touching that sound. I was going to say, yeah. Maybe we should move the mic back.
It was interesting with going to Greenham Common because Greenham Common had a short runway. I think it was about a 5,000 foot runway, 5,000 or 6,000 feet. And guys that get spoiled because at Block Point we had 12,000 foot runway. So if you didn't get on the first couple thousand, you still had plenty left to put it down and to get stopped. The Greenham Common, you had to put it on and get it stopped. And the only thing, the B-47 didn't have reverse thrust or anything like that. You had a drag chute, which the purpose of which was to put it out. And if the airplane was very light, you were down to very light landing weight, you get the power back so far. Now the early, just relatively speaking, the engines on the B-47 were early engines in development jet engines. And as I say, relatively speaking, but the one drawback on the early engines was it took a long time. Again, relatively speaking, it took 5 or 6 seconds. If you took the throttles and went idle and you cobbed it all the way to full power, it might be as much as 6 seconds before you got full power from out of that engine. Well, 6 seconds can be an eternity when you're getting low and slow. And you make the difference between making it to the runway or not. And so to counter this, they installed a drogue chute. It was a smaller chute, basically a drag chute, a smaller one. And it provided increased drag. So the increased drag required to carry a higher power setting. So now you're back to where you got at the higher power settings, where once you get up around the 70, 80%, you had a lot less delay time between what the power setting going from there to 100% power. And then when you landed, you popped, and there was a great big chute that came out, was the brake chute, which braked the airplane, slowed it down. It was interesting, again, it was interesting part of life at that point. You know, the downside was that early on in our career in the Air Force, Marie and I were looking forward to an overseas assignment. We didn't have any kids at that time, but that didn't last long. So, but I got to see parts of England, and the week that you were off, if they had a flight, then usually they would have a flight going to somewhere on the European continent, and on one of those I was able to go to Denmark and tour around Denmark for a week. And another time I went to Germany, and it was there around the time of the Oktoberfest. Man, those people love to drink beer. Good beer. I can see why. It was good beer. But it was interesting. Flying across the Atlantic was a bit of a chore. You know, it was like an 8-hour mission, and you generally left in the middle of the night. You got there in the middle of the morning. 8 hours later, you'd sleep for a day and then go on alert. The Brits, I guess they do their public sector does things, I mean, a lot like the Americans, as far as the utilities and whatnot, and bureaucracy. Little things are sitting on alert. I mean, normally you had training things to keep you busy. You had to study, you had homework to do, you had to study, and we constantly took, and it was, I mean, I'm not saying it wasn't necessary, but we constantly took tests on positive control. And positive control was, you had to have all 3 crew members had to agree on the message that was sending you to war. Was giving you the go code, I should rephrase it, which is in effect sending you to war. So the way it works is the president decides that, you know, he's going to do this, and the Defense Department, I don't know if it's still, I assume it's still in effect, but every once in a while you can see the president, used to be, I don't know about now, maybe Obama keeps him out of sight, but there was this guy in uniform, always had this briefcase, a satchel, with a pair of handcuffs and a chain he was chained to the briefcase, and that contained the go code. So at any time, the thinking was at any time, anywhere, that if something happened, if we were suddenly attacked, then he'd turn to this guy and say, whatever he did, you know, to issue the go code. Well, you'd get the alert, you'd get out to the airplane, and the message would be transmitted to you over the radio. And then all 3 of you would decipher it. And then all three would agree, yes, the right code, and it says yes, and then you launch. So we were always doing that, and you always had to get 100% on the positive control test. There's no such thing as, well, you got 2 wrong, because, you know, the same crew got 2 wrong, and they're headed out where they shouldn't go. It could be a problem. But there were moments when you didn't have anything to do, and we'd sit there, and there was one particular project they had going on. I had a bunch of guys out there, and of course they weren't as mechanically efficient as we were. They didn't have a lot of powered equipment. They had these little hand carts, 2-wheel. Looks like a little dumpster or something. You put dirt in and roll it around, dump it. And they dig these trenches. They were about 2 feet deep and a foot wide. And we never figured out. And we asked, and of course they looked at us like we were from another planet. But what are you guys doing out here? And I don't remember what the explanation was. They even got, it didn't make sense. But we noticed in one period we were over there, 2 weeks we were there, actually 3 weeks, because we were there a week, then we were gone a week, came back the last week. They dug the trench, and filled it, and dug it again, and filled it, and dug it again. And same trench, in the same period. And so that was kind of an interesting, people say, well, what's England like? Well, it's a nice place to visit there, but I'm not sure why the people do what they do. Maybe it was just a make work kind of thing.
I got a question. We're staying with the family side during this time in Columbus. I mean, in 1962,
Yeah.
the Cuban Missile Crisis. How was your communication with Marie and the family during that time? You were on base,
Yeah.
going to. I mean, I'm assuming. I mean, I wasn't old enough to know.
I was
I'm
scared.
assuming that at that time everybody was scared.
I was scared because you didn't know what was going to happen. There had been all this thing about preparation and stocking supply of food, canned goods. I know you couldn't talk a lot about it because much of everything you're doing at that stage is classified. And of course, I talked to Marie, and she was pretty concerned about all of it. And of course, you're watching the news, and depending on those the stations, but it was a lot of anxiety,
And how did you deal with the separation from the family? Because you had 3 young kids.
Yeah, well, I dealt with it as best I could. It was never far from my mind. I think I was able to early on. I learned that when you're flying, you need to concentrate on flying. There's always time to consider not that they're out of your thoughts totally, but you can't sit there and dwell on what might be considered personal problems. And we had other issues, family issues that took place throughout our career. And I think I would consider myself successful that I was able to I guess, compartmentalize the thing so that when I was working, When I wasn't working, then I could able to endure attention. It was sort of in a sense, it was a helpless feeling, because it's like now, if you talk to a dozen people about what should you do in case of a hurricane, a category 4 hurricane is going to hit here, you get 12 different answers, and probably half of them are not feasible, or 2/3 of them are not feasible. One day they thought, well, evacuate. Well, you got 13 million people in Florida, and about probably 8, 9 million, or 10 million of them are in South Florida. And where the hell are 8 or 9 million people going to go? You just can't physically get there from there. And it was a pretty scary time. And you start wondering what's going to happen. And you start, I prayed a lot. God, I hope this doesn't happen. Marie, in general, I have to say that that's why I feel particularly strong about it now. She had 3 children in diapers there for a number of years. Nowadays, that generally doesn't happen unless people want a big family or something where they have one child after another. I was off doing the thing I love to do, was flying around, when I was either with the Air Force or the airline, and she was home raising the kids. As I look now and doing things that I do now, I don't know how she did it. I really don't, without going out of her mind. And our kids were, as growing up, they were pretty good. I mean, until later on we started having some problems, but the kids were, and the kids had fond memories of being there. The above ground pool the neighbors gave us, and then it collapsed one day while I was out on a trip and flooded the backyard, and the fire department came over and had to pump the water out. And it's funny, you know, I would come back from a trip and I knew as soon as I walked in the door, something was wrong because the 3 kids were there to tell me about it. And yeah, this kind of thing, well, Dad, you'll never guess what happened. And I'm tired, I don't want to play guessing game. What happened? Well, I don't know if we should tell you, you know, and kind of wanting to, especially they thought they'd done something wrong. And wanted forgiveness before they told you what happened. But yeah, it was pretty scary, and I'm sure a lot of other people felt the same way. I mean, I wasn't the only one. It was a pretty scary time. I mean, we probably went to the brink as a nation. It was something to think about. But glad it was over when they turned away. The ships turned away, and they didn't call Kennedy's bluff, if you can call it that.
Yeah, it wasn't a bluff.
Huh?
It probably wasn't a bluff.
No, it probably wasn't. He was prepared. You had to do something. It was probably the other way around. Probably Khrushchev's bluff. But yeah,
Those kinds of things.
Yeah, I mean, it was. You were, and I'm sure you, especially younger folks, you know, young people think they're bulletproof. Yeah. And it's probably not so much arrogance, but it's optimism.
Yeah.
You know, they get the whole life ahead of them, and
yeah.
everything's coming up roses, and they've got an education, or they've been through high school, and you know, it's looking good. And then you find out they're not bulletproof. Yeah. And like what we were talking about last night, you know, like that couple that I told you, that the guy that got killed in the aborted takeoff. Yeah. I mean, it was sad from the standpoint of the loss of life, but they were a really lovely couple, a beautiful couple. She was probably one of the most attractive women I've ever seen, and he was a good-looking guy. And I mean, that it's enough to bring tears to your eyes.
So yeah, so I'd like to, Joe, just concentrate, you know, on that period, and then at least another hour or so, but just about, okay, then you went to the airlines.
Yeah.
And how life, you know, and wrap up from the airlines till now. Your thoughts about what it was like in the airlines, and, you know, basically doing the same thing, but not at war. You know, and what that was like, raising the kids, about the kids, grandkids, the older years, and any thoughts that you may think that would be like when everybody's sitting around sometime and, hey, what was grandpa like? When people, kids that aren't even born yet, you know, what was my great-grandfather like? Well, you know, just those thoughts of sometime like, hey, these are all the things that you'd like your family to know that maybe never knew. You know? Does that make sense?
Yeah, oh yeah.
Okay. Is that, you guys got any?
Okay, where we left off, we were based, Marine I and the kids were based at Columbus Air Force Base, and that organization was being phased out. And of course, everybody was up for reassignment. And originally, I was slated to be assigned to Amarillo Air Force Base in Texas in a B-52 outfit. And then that changed, and I was informed that I would be assigned to Clark Air Base, to the TAC fighter wing at Tactical Air Command fighter wing at Clark Air Base in the Philippines. And it was kind of a surprise. I didn't know anything about it. I mean, Vietnam was building up at that time, was an issue, was in the news, but I didn't connect the two immediately. And initially, we were told that, I was informed that I would travel, or my family would travel concurrently. It would be concurrent travel. We'd go at the same time, which would made everybody happy. We're all going to go over together. And you're normally notified about these things like 90 days before they happen, if not more. And wasn't long after the initial notification that they came back and said it would not be concurrent travel, but it would be that the family would travel within a matter of weeks after I traveled. And that changed for the worse. In other words, there was a greater time period before the family would be allowed to travel as time went on, which I'll explain later, going into actually going to Clark. I looked forward to it at the time. At that time, I was basically a career person. I was going to stay in the Air Force for 20 years, planned to. And I was had always been in the Strategic Air Command before that. And life is different in the Strategic Air Command and outside the Strategic Air Command. For example, the crew members, cockpit crew members could never take, in the Strategic Air Command, it was policy that the cockpit crew members could never take more than 15 days leave at a time. Now, the Air Force standard policy is or the services standard policy is you get 30 days paid leave each year. But in SAC, they restricted it further. I never really understood the reason behind that, other than the fact that, for a number of years, the only thing that I guess kept us from going to war with Russia or Russia attacking us was the fact that we had the Strategic Air Command, which they knew would bomb the hell out of them at first light. So that was one of the things that, well, we'll be out of the Strategic Air Command and we'll be able to take 30 days leave and travel around and see this and that and the other and so forth. And they look forward to it in that sense. Marie, when Marie was pregnant with Donna, no, she just had Donna, and so I was happy from that standpoint that we would travel together and I could help her with the kids, be there for her. And we were at Columbus and sold the house. And then as it became apparent that they wouldn't travel with me, the family wouldn't travel with me while they had to go somewhere in the meantime, rather than stay in Columbus by themselves, they went east to Portland, Connecticut to be around family. So we got all that done, and Marie's parents actually came out and helped her take her and the kids back to Portland. And then I left, I don't remember the exact date, but I left to go to the West Coast and then shipped from there to Clark Air Base. It's a long flight. It was about 22 hours.
Oh, hold on 1 second. We left the TV
Is
on.
the TV on? Yeah.
What's the matter?
We left the TV on.
I can hear every once in a while talking.
Oh.
But it's really faint, but you can pick it up a little.
Okay.
Just hang on till it gets back.
I think pretty sensitive.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
So I can say, as a result of that trip over there, I can say I've been on Guam. It was only for a couple hours, but stopped in there to refuel. And I remember getting to Vietnam, and I actually did the Clark. I didn't go to Vietnam. I went to Clark Air Base in the Philippines. I remember getting there and getting off the airplane and making my way to the officers' quarters. And got there, they had a room ready for me, assigned to me, and walking into the room and sitting down and putting my head in my hands and saying, what the hell did I get myself into now? Yeah, because it had become a concern at that time. Really no idea of, there was just a lot of maybes. Maybe your family will come in 3 or 4 weeks, or maybe they won't. And so I got there. Not long after I was there, I came down with pneumonia, ended up in the hospital for 10 days, and then got out of there. And finally got my strength back and started my checkout program in a B-57, because I had never been in the airplane before. So They had said that when they, being Air Force personnel, had said that when you get to the Philippines, they'll be able to give you a little better idea about when your family will travel. So check with them as soon as with personnel as soon as you get there. So which I did, and of course when I got there, it was even 2 or 3 weeks longer than they had said when I left the States. So every week or two, it seemed like the time was lengthened before they would be able to travel. And in retrospect, I guess that happened because of the rapid buildup of troops strength for the operation in Vietnam. 65 was sort of the beginning of it, the earlier stages. I've talked to people who were there after I left, because I left in 1966, and they said the place became so crowded that they had people bivouacked in tents on the parade field, so they didn't have room for them in any of the permanent barracks. It was going to be our first overseas assignment together as a family, and I remember when I first got the assignment, learned about it at Columbus. They said, "Well, that's great. That's a garden spot of Southeast Asia. People go there and they love it. Labor's very cheap. You'll end up with a houseboy who'll wash your car every day, and your wife will have a maid who'll come in and clean and cook and take care of the kids, and life will be just great." And so we're kind of looking forward to all those reasons. And I mean, it didn't take long to figure out that it was a backdoor assignment to Vietnam, but being in the service, you go with the flow. Everything, I mean, we stayed in contact. When it was tough on Marie, because she had, the kids were a little, Steve, Greg, and Gene, of course, were a little older now. They were 65. Steve was 9 years old, so 9, 8, and 7. So they were able to help her with Donna. And but still, there was a separation, the effect of the separation. Marie used to write. We'd try to write frequently back and forth. There wasn't a lot of calling. It wasn't really convenient to get to place calls and so forth. We tried to work it out. We got at least 3 or 4 or 5 letters a week going back and forth. And they would send me 8mm film from pictures of the kids in the pool in the backyard and the family get-togethers. And while you're doing something in the aspect of flying and what's asked of you, the separation is a hardship. And I felt it, and I know Marie and the kids, particularly Marie, felt it. But again, you do what you have to do. That goes, part of it goes with the territory. Vietnam was an interesting place from the standpoint of flying over it, and a lot of beautiful countryside. I remember one mission that we were running, trying to. They had you probably heard about Agent Orange. Well, they had, the Air Force had C-123s that were equipped to spray Agent Orange. And, but they had to do that at low altitude, a couple 100 feet, 150 feet or something. And of course they were prime targets at that altitude for any ground fire. So the plan was to send the B-57s out, 4 ships would go out, and they had the course that was plotted where they were going to spray, and two of the B-57s would orbit at a higher altitude, and 2 would go down, and you'd go just ahead of the crisscross along the flight path or the spray path, just ahead of the C-123, and just every once in a while you'd squeeze off a burst of cannon fire from either your 50 calibers or 20mm cannon from the airplane. And the idea was hopefully to keep everybody's head down. You sometimes wonder about the strategy. I mean, if the enemy knew anything about our tactics and the way they worked, then as soon as the airplane flew by, then he was safe to jump up out of the bushes and shoot at the C-123. So it would seem like it'd be a much more effective procedure or tactic would be to use a helicopter or something. And part of the plan was that the guys in the C-123 had a smoke grenade, so if they started taking ground fire, they'd just throw a grenade out of the airplane, and wherever that smoke came up out of the jungle was an indication there was somebody down there. So you'd go in and strafe it and maybe drop a 260-pound frag bomb in it. An interesting thing about working there and dropping ordnance into the foliage, I guess you'd say it. I can't describe to you how thick the vegetation growth there, and I personally remember dropping 500-pound bombs into the growth, the trees and the bushes and everything, and seeing no reaction. Now, 500-pound bomb is a pretty powerful explosive, and creates a pretty good blast and concussion wave and all that. And if you saw anything, it was just maybe a little bit of shaking of the trees and the leaves on the trees. 1,000-pounder, I remember dropping 1,000-pound into the surface, and you saw the concussion wave, the condensation on the concussion wave from the 1,000-pound. But anything like you're used to seeing in the movies where you see the earth erupt in a big cloud of dirt and debris, and which never ceased to amaze me, how that, you wonder what else was going on down below that, all that vegetation. Because we were trying to interdict supply lines that were very well hidden, except when you got into mountainous areas sometimes where they had to cut a road on the side of a mountain. But it was interesting. On one particular flight, I didn't see it, but I was down doing that, what I described, the pre-attack ahead of the C-123 to suppress any ground fire, and it just squeezed off around a few seconds of fire, and my navigator in the back seat said, look out to the right. He said 2 o'clock. And of course, we're down low now, and I'm back to flying the airplane. I gotta be looking around while I'm down 150 feet, going 300 miles an hour. And I didn't see it, but he said he saw a tiger, a full-grown tiger, go bounding off in an area where wasn't so much vegetation, obviously. And moments like that kind of give you a pause, and you wonder, geez, for what we're doing here, what effect is it having on the people and the animals? It's that have nothing to do with it, have no control, and this poor animal was probably scared out of its mind with all that crap flying around after shooting, or if you're dropping any 260-pound frag bombs. We worked out of Da Nang, Da Nang. There was 2 squadrons, an 8th Bomb Squadron and a 13th Bomb Squadron at Clark, based at Clark. And they were originally based at Japan, and they were on assigned temporary duty to Clark to support the Vietnam effort. But the B-57s had an EWO or EWO mission into China, which stands for Emergency War Order, which is basically going to war. And it would carry a smaller size nuclear weapon, and you would fly to a predetermined target in China and deliver the weapon. So that responsibility always had to be covered. So there was the other 2 squadrons. If one squadron was at Da Nang, the other squadron was at Clark to cover the EWO mission, requirement, and then every 60 days it flip-flops. So, you spend 60 days at Clark, and then 60 days at Da Nang, and then 60 days at Clark. The B-57 started out at Ben Hoa Air Base, which is down near the capital, I guess, of Vietnam. And a lot of the predominance of ordnance that was used in Vietnam came from leftover stockpiles, believe it or not, from World War II. And the B-57s would, one of the favorite tactics in dropping this stuff, they would take these 500 and 1,000-pound bombs and put a time delay fuse in it. And you'd go out and you'd drop it along an area that was thought to be used as a supply route. And you'd drop these things, like say, on a roadway. And then whatever the time fuse was set to, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 hours after, such a great picture that it does it. Where did we stop?
Dropping the time bomb.
Okay.
And go out the fibers. So. Good.
Good to go?
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Yeah, so as I was saying, one of the missions of B-57 was to take and drop time delay bombs onto the supply lines, supply routes, and hopefully interdict the supply effort of the enemy. We also mostly flew interdiction missions in South Vietnam itself. Some flights were made into North Vietnam. I never made that. I was supposed to go out on one mission to North Vietnam, and the airplane I had malfunctioned, and by the time I could get to the reserve airplane, somebody else had taken it, so I didn't get to fly to North Vietnam, which didn't really make me too unhappy. We also worked in Cambodia, which our government denied for a long time. Lost some people over there, some airplanes and some people, and you never heard anything about it because I guess they weren't supposed to be there. But typical mission ran about an hour and a half. I have some vivid memories of one particular mission, a nighttime mission in Cambodia. Another tactic that was tried was to send a C-130 to an air target area and at night, and they would drop flares, which would light up the night. So what you could see target and everything. But it was, the best way I can describe what it was like flying under flares, or operating with flares, was if you can envision putting your eyeball inside of a freshly emptied milk bottle. It's all coated with that white milk on the inside of the glass. So you've got that kind of a aura or vision of what you're flying in the space. It's just that kind of white milky look. And I don't remember the specifics. It seems to me that we had some kind of a communication procedure set up, but you had to be careful that you didn't give up anything that would help the enemy locate you, and because you're down at low altitude, and we're down in Indian country, so-called. But I remember the C-130 had radar, and I assumed they could pick out targets on the ground. So if they saw trucks moving or armor or troops or something like that, they could see they were moving, and then they would come in and they would come by the area and draw a string of flares, which would last as long as it takes them to float to the ground on a parachute, so it wasn't a long time. But I remember that one particular mission, now we had navigation lights on the airplanes, of course, and the idea was, so you didn't want to have your navigation lights on because then they could see you flying around. And if they wanted to aim their anti-aircraft fire at you, it made their job easier. So, and the same thing with the 130. So we're flying blacked out, basically. And I remember making a run in on a target after he'd, under the flares, and I pulled up, and I was making a slightly banked right turn, and I looked down, something caught my eye, and I looked down out of the right side of the windshield or the canopy, and here was a C-130 going by. And I knew it was there, but it was there because he had position lights on top of his wings that were on. And so I don't know how, I know we weren't very far apart. Maybe it was, it might have been 100 feet, it might have been less, it might have been 50 feet. But I guess that's one of the risks you involve when you're doing stuff like that. You know, it's risky business, and there's always a chance that something can go wrong. And there was a lot of different tactics that were tried. They tried, the Defense Department tried, the generals tried bringing 102s over, and they'd send the 102s out. And now 102 is an air interceptor. That's all it's designed to do, was to intercept enemy airplanes coming from wherever. So they'd send these things out, and if they could find campfires, they'd go in and fire off a heat-seeking missile into the campfire. Now, you know, this is what we heard at the sort of the ground level. So if that was actually, I mean, I know that 102s were there, and I remember they've seen them launch out and go out and make strikes and everything, but it was hard to wonder later on about the strategy of, it would seem to me that all you do is piss off a bunch of guys when you put a missile in the middle of their campfire. They gotta start a new fire and maybe put the cooking pots back in there later on, but you know, it's crazy stuff goes on in wars. Really crazy stuff, and people try to figure out how to you know, a new tactic that'll overwhelm the enemy or give them a leg up, an advantage. And I understand it. I understand it is to kill those guys, defeat them, and so forth. But sometimes it makes you wonder who's thinking and why these ideas come from.
How many mission flights did you have in Vietnam?
78.
78. How many were in Cambodia?
There was probably about 20. Now, interestingly, for a bit of perspective, in World War II, 25 missions was it, and then you rotated out of the combat zone. But I would hasten to add that in World War II, the anti-aircraft operation and flak and ground fire and everything was, like some of the guys said, you could almost get out and walk on it. It was so thick. So it did a lot of difference. I mean, we didn't operate, and I never operated in an area. Now, the guys who really got hammered were the F-4 and the F-105 drivers who went up into North Vietnam and hit some of the targets up there around Hanoi and so forth. And the North Vietnamese would set up anti-aircraft batteries on the sides of the hills. And as you'd come down to hit a target in the valley, this withering fire would come from either side. And you had to basically fly through a gauntlet of a ground fire. So the losses up there were pretty heavy. And surprisingly, when they introduced the B-52s into the program, we lost like 13 or 14 B-52s to SAM fire, you know, surf-to-air missile fire. And I think one of the tactics that came out of that was, of course, the B-52 has a self-contained electronic countermeasures capability, But the way the North Vietnamese got around that is they salvoed multiple SAMs at the same time. And the idea was you may launch a dozen of them, maybe 8 or 9 of them will get deflected, but 1 or 2 or 3 will get through, which they did. Some of the prisoners of war were out of B-52s that were shot down. And yeah, it was some interesting things. Well, on the bright side, we lived in as aviators. We lived in barracks, hard constructed barracks, screened thing, nothing. There was no glass windows over there because it was never cold enough to need glass. I mean, it did get chilly once in a while, but it was a really tropical climate. And slept in a bed with sheets. And I say that because when you flew into when you went into Vietnam, you qualified for an R&R trip, and frequently the R&R trip was a 7-day visit to Bangkok, Thailand, which I went on one of those. And sitting on the airplane riding over there, I was sitting next to a Marine artillery captain, and he described his living conditions as an artillery captain. It was pretty much living in the jungle, living out of a foxhole a lot of times. You'd dig a hole, and you never knew who was going to be your companion in that house. In that foxhole, it might be a rat, or it might be a snake, or whatever. And the monsoon season was particularly bad because everything was wet and water everywhere. And he'd been in here for 9 months. I think it was 9 months. And he come over there, and he was the first one off the airplane and the last one on when we left 7 days later. And I saw him a couple times downtown, and he had at least 2 girls on each arm. In one bar, out in another bar. The point being, guys, people lived hard and played hard. And I got to think some of the feeling was, I don't know if I want to be here tomorrow. So, I guess when I was telling you about that is one of the main points of my experience over there. The time I went out on a mission, and they shot at me and hit the airplane with 3 bullets. And I guess we talked about this last night, but for the purpose of the recording, or maybe I don't think I mentioned it earlier. Went out on a mission and came back, and went into debriefing, which was standard procedure to gain intelligence about the area which you made the strike, and if it was successful, wasn't successful, what did you hit, how many, what did you see, and what did you expend, and so forth. And came back, and I was completed debrief, which usually didn't take very long. It might take 15, 20 minutes, 30 minutes at the most. And I come out of the debrief room, and just about that time, a captain from maintenance came in and asked, he said, "Is there a Captain Amato here?" And yeah, that's me. And he said, "I got something for you." And he gave me this bullet. And it's about the size of a 45, or maybe a little slightly larger caliber. And he says, we found 3 of these in the airplane, 1 in each engine and 1 in the bomb bay. And fortunately, it didn't hit anything and cause any problems, so you never knew you'd been hit. And I thanked him, and everybody kind of, "Oh, gee whiz, wow, holy mackerel." And went back in a debriefing and told him about it, and so, well, yeah, that surely indicates there's a hot area, there's somebody down there. Well, I'm walking back to the barracks, and I'm thinking to myself, son of a bitch, those guys are trying to kill me. What the hell's the matter with them? I'm just over here doing what I'm asked to do, told to do. I'm following orders. Bypassing the idea that it's a two-way street. We're trying to kill them, they're trying to kill us. But I don't know, I guess I was naive about it when I first went into it. And I was thinking, well, I'm just here doing the job I'm supposed to do. Who's going to fault me for that, right? So.
How long were you into your missions? Like, what mission would you say that was?
I was probably about halfway through, about somewhere around 30, 35, 40 missions. I mean, I gained enough experience and knowledge that, know that it was serious. I mean, it was serious, but it was never a lark or anything like that. Don't misunderstand me. But it just struck me that I don't know why that thought probably should never come into my head. I was just walking along and I was thinking, oh, dirty bastards, they're trying to kill me. And they realize that I'm just going to do this for 12 months. I want to go home to my family. Why do they want to kill me? But then, as things happen, one of the things while I was there, I said, gee, I'd like to swim in the South China Sea. So I can say that I swam in the South China Sea. And so what we do is they'd give us a Jeep, and 3 or 4 or 5 of us, and we'd drive from the base down to the beach and take a couple of M16s with us. And somebody was swimming, a couple of guys would stand guard because you never knew what would happen. Sympathizers spring up out of nowhere and start shooting. But it didn't happen to us. When we went down and had a picnic and swam in the South China Sea and went back to the base and made it successfully. But another group of guys were on the way back from the base, and there was a group of children side of the road begging. And they stopped, and usually when you went down a place like this, you either took some cigarettes with you or candy bars, because they were always great to bargain with for anything. And so they'd given the kids candy bars, and there was a lot of nodding and so forth, and the kids didn't speak English, and those guys didn't speak Vietnamese, so everything was all hand gestures and head gestures. So then okay, goodbye, and they get ready to leave, and as they're pulling away, one of these youngsters, probably 12, 13 years old, tosses a grenade into the Jeep, pulls a pin and tosses a grenade into the Jeep. And fortunately, one of the guys in the Jeep caught it and tossed it back on the other side of the road, and it blew up harmlessly. Didn't hurt anybody other than a lot of noise. But that was the kind of thing you had to be aware of if you were out around the countryside. You never knew who the enemy was. So that kind of put a damper on trips to the beach. We thought maybe we'll stay home and take a long shower or something.
Guys fly over from Clark to Da Nang.
Yeah, pretty much.
How many guys did you fly with? Just to give an idea, like.
It was probably, in a squadron, we probably had 35, 40 pilots.
Yeah. If
that many. Yeah, same guys. And
did you ever lose any in any of these missions?
Oh yeah. We lost. We lost the pilot, the navigator, and the airplane, the accident right there, Da Nang on takeoff. The guy that went down in Cambodia he and I bonded because he was from Connecticut, as was I.
Hold on one second.
So, as I said, the guy that went down in Cambodia, I was in Bangkok at the time that happened. I came back and got off the airplane, and you say, hey, what's new? Well, so-and-so lost so-and-so on a night mission over Cambodia. And I never heard any, of course I didn't, there was no way to really follow up on it, if anybody ever went in there and found the wreckage or the remains or anything. But he was from Connecticut, as was I, and we used to talk about that fact. And we had another flight that really was a mystery. They were flying in a group of, another tactic that they tried was, which made a little more sense. See, the B-57 had, for navigation equipment, it had an ADF receiver and a DME, TACAN. That was it. No radar, nothing else. And basically it was essentially for bombing, it was on its own, and our strafing, of course, obviously it was a VFR operation. You had to be able to see what you were shooting at. Well, then they got the idea they would take a B-66, which is a 2-engine bomber, had radar, and it would lead a group of 4, 5, or 6 ships following him to a target area, and then on his command, predicated on their calculations, the B-57s would release their bombs, which he was given the command based on his radar returns and information. And one of those missions, they were in and out of the cloud, which didn't make any difference because the guy's using radar. You don't need to see the ground or the target. And came out of the other side of the cloud bank, and one of the airplanes was missing, the B-57. Nobody heard an explosion. Nobody heard a distress call. No one heard anything. Just the airplane just disappeared. And so it gets a little spooky sometimes. I wonder what happened.
And any of them ever go down and they recover them? You don't go in after them or find them or find what happened?
Not in our squadron, no. That brings up an interesting sidelight. When we were back at Clark, we were expected to maintain proficiency. So we'd go to the bombing range and drop small practice bombs and fire small practice missiles. And part of the training to deliver the nuclear weapon that you would carry in a war mission was a toss maneuver where the airplane pulls up into a vertical position, and at the right moment and the right amount of G's on the airplane, you release the weapon, and the weapon releases from the airplane and continues climbing, and then slowly arcs over and comes down lands in the target area, while the delivery airplane goes over and essentially does like an emblem. It's over and rolls level, but nose down, and you're going as fast as you can, power to the max to get away from the blast effect of the weapon. And so you had to practice that. And one of the big things with getting checked out with that and then get rechecked was not knowing where you'd be, what kind of conditions you might be in between cloud layers. You may be get up somewhere like this, and you're in the clouds. Can't see, no visual references outside the airplane. So you had a lot of practice with unusual attitudes. And the guy in the back seat would put the airplane in an unusual attitude. You'd kind of like cover up your eyes. You wouldn't look at the instruments. And he'd put the airplane into an unusual attitude, and he'd say, "You got it." So now you've got to look at the instruments and interpret what you're in and what corrective action takes, like you were talking about earlier about that Airbus. You got to interpret the instruments and what kind of position you're in and take appropriate action. And I found out, didn't find out about early on. It was later on, because what happened was there was an area, believe it or not, that is still inhabited by headhunters. And there was a Philippine Air Force guy. I don't remember what he was flying, but he jumped out, had to abandon the airplane. And they got a hold of him on the ground. And a helicopter went up and picked him up. Before they could pick him up, these guys already had him buried up to his neck in the ground, and had pretty much taken him apart. And yeah, you get up there flying around, and like the instructor says, you better be able to recover the airplane, especially up here. He says, it's probably worse than if you were somewhere else in the heavens. You might have time, he says, but you got to jump out of the airplane over here. Your real troubles just start. Yeah. And I remember after that, it was kind of a curiosity thing. You'd be up in that area, and when you had a little extra time and fuel, so you'd kind of fly over the area a little lower altitude and see what you could see down there. I mean, it's interesting to see, well how do the headhunters live? What does their village look like or something? And I remember they were right over near the coast by the water, and I remember going down one time, and the idea was, we used to also play games with some of the fishermen. We'd go out and we'd be up at 15, 20,000 feet, and we'd see these boats down there, and we'd get over close to them, and we'd pull the power back to idle, so the engines, least amount of noise, and then you'd just glide down, but at a high speed rate, and you'd come down, and you get right down on the water, and fly right at the boats. And this is the ugly American part of it all. The idea was to see how many guys you could get jump into the water, jump on a boat, because they thought you were going to blow the boat over. And he'd come back and it'd be at the old club that night. How many guys did you get in the water? Oh, I put 2 guys in the water. How many did you get? Oh, I got 5. Oh, you're buying the beers. And but I remember this one time I see this guy out in the water, in the shallow water, just off the beach, and he's gathering wood. It looked like he had a big stack of wood on his back. So I came down to take a closer look. I came down really low across. Man, I guess he didn't know what the hell was coming or what was happening. Something big out of the sky was coming to get him, because that wood went flying in one direction, and I swear he walked on water. He was moving so fast trying to get back to the beach. Some of the little things that stick with you. Where was I?
Is there anything about any of your?
Well,
missions
yeah,
that-
I mean, kind of tie it in there, to tying some things together. In the meantime, the clock is ticking on whether Marie and the kids are going to come over. And every time I go to check with personnel, well, sorry, but Captain, but it'd be delayed another 2-3 weeks or something. And I have to write to Marie and tell her and keep telling them. And of course, at that time, Marie and the kids had been going to Westover Air Force Base and going to the medical facility up there and getting all the shots they needed before they could come over. So they were getting prepared. And then it finally dawned on me that, and I don't know whether somebody said it to me or what, but it's like, well, if an unaccompanied tour is 12 months, an accompanied tour is 18 months. So I thought, does it make sense to be here 7 months and bring them over for another 9 months, or does it make more sense to spend 5 more months here and then go somewhere else and maybe get an assignment somewhere else, obviously. And I decided that made more sense then, because the base was pretty much over capacity. It was stretched to the limits on bringing people through. It was not a really good thing. You had the constant scenario that, okay, honey, it's not like you're going to work tomorrow and I'll be back in a couple of weeks. Well, I'm going to war tomorrow, honey. If I'm lucky, I'll see you in 60 days. Or if things go, God willing, I'll see you in 60 days. So then you come back 60 days and you got 60 days when things are probably going to be okay and you're not going to be too vulnerable. And it's all over again. Now, okay, goodbye, honey, goodbye, kids. Daddy's going to war. And as I've processed it in my mind over the years, thinking about it afterwards, there's a lot of truth that things happen for a reason. And I thought, well, that was probably a good thing, because I think that's a lot of pressure to put on the family. It's bad enough being separated, 3, 4, 5, 6,000, I say 6, 7,000 miles away, but right there, you're always hearing about the accidents and they're right there and what's going on, and so what progressed after that was I knew I had to look forward. What I had to look forward to was, as I mentioned earlier, once I got out of SEC, I was eligible to take my 30 days leave all at once. So I went in and I put in for 30 days leave. I put on there for my leave address, Portland, Connecticut. And the squadron commander called me and he says, well, not the squadron commander at that point, it was the guy in personnel. He says, well, you can't, the adjutant maybe, I guess it was, he said, you can't go to Connecticut. I said, what do you mean I can't go to Connecticut? He said, you can only, people from Vietnam on leave can only go as far east as Hawaii. And I said, really? I said, well, why is that? And of course, when you ask why, that's not, you know, a lot of people in the military don't take the superiors don't take the why word. It's not in their vocabulary. They tell you something and it's supposed to be one way. And, which I understand to a certain degree. It's not a fraternity, you know, it's a military organization and orders are orders. But anyway, I said, why? And he says, well, that's the way it is. And so I don't know what came over me. I guess I was possessed or something. The devil made me do it. But I said, well, now let me see. The people in Europe, when they go on leave, they can only come as far west as Iceland or something like that? And the answer I got was, how would you like an Article 15 for insubordination? I said, never mind. So withdraw the question. So I went back. I was the deputy flight leader. There was a flight leader, was Rick Duran. I was a deputy flight leader. Myself and a guy by the name of Don Chute rented an apartment on base. Had a lady, a little Filipino girl that came, a woman, they came in and kept the place clean and so forth and made the beds and whatnot. And so I went to Rick Duran and I said, Rick, I want to tell you so that you can cover your ass. I'm going to go on leave. And I knew a guy who flew in and out of Clark on the C-130s. I'd known him from Columbus. And I got a hold of him one day at the officers club and I said, what would it take if I wanted to hitch a ride back to the States on a C-130? I said, no problem. He said, just come down and we'll put you on a manifest and away you can jump on the airplane, you go. And the same thing going back. So I said, okay. And so I went to Duran. I said, this is what I'm going to do, just so you know. And you can tell me I said that I shouldn't do it, but I said, I'm just telling you so you can cover yourself because I'm going to do it, period. And of course, Chute knew about it because he was my roommate in the apartment. So Duran says to me, well, how much room is there on the C-130? So I ended up, Duran, myself, and Chute all get on this 130. And they came back by Guam, and then we stopped on the West Coast, and they dropped Duran off, I think, in Sacramento or something. And then Chute and I flew to Smyrna, Tennessee, and got off the airplane there and jumped on a commercial flight. And I remember where Don went, the shore where he was in Indiana or something. And I flew to Portland. And I didn't tell anybody about it because I didn't know if it was gonna work, you know. And I didn't want to get Marie's hopes up and the kids and so forth. So it was nice. I showed up at the door. Here out of the blue, here's Daddy. And spent 30 days and then flew back down to Smyrna, got on a C-130 and flew back. The other guys came back around the same time. And another little tidbit about it, you had to give a leave address somewhere in Hawaii. Well, we had a guy in the outfit, his name was Ty something. I got his other name on the orders, but he was Hawaiian. He's from Hawaii. So I went to him, I said, Ty, I said, I need an address in Hawaii for leave address that'll take them 2-3 months to find it. Because by that time I'll be back. So I said, but you got to give me something that's, you know, nobody can find. So he gave me an address. So we put that variation of that address on our leave orders. I still, to this day, I don't know where the hell it was. I don't want to know. But, you know, all the little things you do to connive when you have to. And that was a pleasant part of the thing, and worked out pretty well. Beyond that, when I, with that, then I was, it was approaching my 12 months, and it came and they said, we're going to send you to command and staff school. And I had a commission, reserve commission in the Air Force. And command and staff is usually something for people that are progressing up the command line. And it's a tough school. It's not an easy school. And I'd been to Squadron officer school, which is, no comparison. And I had tried to get a regular commission earlier in my career, but the fact that I didn't have a college degree, I think was what held it back. So it was turned down. And, you know, I thought seriously about it, and I said, gee, you know, do I want to go and bust my chops to get through command and staff school? I've got a reserve commission. I'd seen other guys with reserve commissions, and when they got to, like the major I was telling you about that was our squadron commander, when they got to 17 years, if they weren't promoted to the next grade, they were forced out. And I thought I could very possibly see that happening. The other option was to, I guess, to go and get a degree, go to night school or something, or correspondence school and get a degree and get around it that way, but it didn't occur to me at that time. And then the experience with it got very political, like with the thing on the leave, not being able to travel all the way to where you wanted to go. And I knew the airlines were hiring. I said, you know, that's what I've always wanted to do, is fly airplanes, and I'd still be flying airplanes. So I wrote to Marine. I said, what would you think if we got out of the Air Force? And she said, well, it's certainly up to you. So whatever, it's your call. So I put in my papers and said, I don't want to be.
When you were in Clark?
Yeah. And that just proceeded in normal. They rotated me back to Travis Air Force Base. And while I was there, I went and interviewed with TWA, I think United and American. And talk about being naive. I guess I had a chip on my shoulder because I went and did the test at American, and they said, okay, we want to hire you. And this guy in the office that took care of all this, the scheduling person, said, I get you into the school starts the week after next. I get you started in the class. I said, hey. Just take it easy. I've been gone 12 months away from my family and everybody. I'm going to go home and spend some time with my family. I'll call you when I'm ready to go to school. And this guy's sitting there like somebody sucker punched him. And I found out later on what that was all about. American was hiring like 300 guys a month at that time. 300 guys. Now that's 300 guys that go on the seniority list. And 300 guys is a lot of numbers on a seniority list. I spent 19 years as a pilot with American as a co-pilot. If I'd have gone to that next class next week, that probably would have been more like 10 or 12 years as a co-pilot. So, too soon old and too late smart. I said, oh, that's the way that works.
Take a little break.
Yep.
But the thing that totally drives me up the wall is when the president says, oh, well, we don't want to destroy them. We don't want to wipe them out. We don't want to kill them. We just want to. And I'm thinking to myself, two reasons. First, what person in their right mind would give away that part of your strategy, your plan? I mean, the idea is to keep them guessing. They don't know what the hell we're going to do. But you give, it's like well, we're going to pull out of Afghanistan in whatever it is, the end of 2014 and 2015. Well, now you've given them the timetable. I know it's an extremely difficult task to do the withdrawal without having some kind of timetable for it, but to broadcast it wholesale and put it out there, I just don't understand this guy's thinking, the president. I just don't understand. I mean, and then to give away the thing that we tried to rescue the hostages when they thought they were in Syria. Why would you mention that? Why would you give away that? Why would you confirm that happened? Maybe the people there, ISIS didn't know that was confirmed that it was American. Maybe it had been mercenaries or something. Who knows?
Tell me when you're ready.
I'm good. But you can't eat that apple.
Why not? Tell me when you're ready.
When you finish the apple, we're ready.
So, okay, so we're done at Clark. We talked about the picture, so you moved back to Connecticut at that point, right? On Linder.
Yeah, I got out of there. We were separated and went back to Connecticut. And then when I called and said, "Okay, I'm ready to go to school," they said, "Well, we sent you information to you." And I said, "Where'd you send it?" They said, "To Clark Air Base." So that's great. I'm on Connecticut. So that kind of held things up for a couple of weeks. I finally started school in September of 1966. So July, there's 3 months later than I could have had the opportunity, which was probably at least 6, if not 800 or 900 numbers, which makes a big difference. And that can affect you all through your career, because the thing with the airline, everything is based on seniority. I mean, you move up to the higher paying equipment, your working conditions, your vacations, on and on and on. Everything's based on seniority, which some of it I don't agree with. I don't see why the same guys have to have the holidays off every year. I mean, I don't see why it can't be in the interest of, a little more spread the wealth around kind of thing. Maybe let some of the junior guys with family have the holidays off for a change instead of working every holiday. Because when things stagnate, the junior guys are always junior, and the senior guys are always senior. And it's doesn't quite seem fair. But then the old guys will tell you, you knew what it was, what you were getting into when you signed on. So that's the way it is. Get over it. Came back. I signed in with American. Started school in Chicago, Illinois, and American Airlines had a school there at that time. I started out as a flight engineer in a Lockheed Electra, and went to school there. Marie stayed out there, and the kids were there, and school was, I think it was about 90 days, 3 months. And then we had an opportunity to pick a base to be assigned to where we wanted to fly out of. And I thought about Chicago, and Marie said no, she didn't really think Chicago, didn't want to live around that area. And didn't really have time to go around, and really get into the details of what was available. I mean, I knew we could move up. We could have lived and worked out of Wisconsin, probably. Didn't have the taxes that Illinois does. Didn't have to live right there in Chicago area. So we picked New York, and because I could live in Connecticut. Well, actually, we left on Long Island, so we moved. We came back east and started out again. Ever the naive I was, because the way we'll handle this is we'll just drive up to the border at Greenwich and we'll start looking at houses and places. So I get to Connecticut and I talked to a real estate agent. They said, "Well, what do you want to spend?" I was on, what was I on at that time? $500 a month or something for the first year of probation. And he said, well, you know, we can, for like $70,000, we can give you this little 2-room thing over to somebody's garage. It's like I got a wife and 4 kids, you got talking, you know, 2 rooms. And it soon became apparent that we need to move further up inland to the more moderate area price-wise. And so then we went out and looked out on Long Island, and of course we found a house there on Long Island. It was our first house after getting out of the service, and it was for $49,000. We got a 3-bedroom on a 1/4-acre lot, a little tiny lot, but down a nice side street. We even had our own in-residence member of the mob that lived up in a corner intersecting street about 4 houses up from us, and he was in the garbage business of all things. And his name was Garofalo, or Garofolo we pronounce it. Some people, other people don't, Garofalo. And he was famous for doing things like he'd owe somebody money and say, well, come out of the house and I'll pay you cash. So the guy come over to the house. He'd say, well, come at 8 o'clock tonight. By then it was dark out. He'd come over to the house and come in, and he'd give him his money, and he'd say, okay, when you were walking up to the house, you walk up the driveway, you walk right next to this tall hedge. And so when you left, you're walking by a tall hedge. Well, the guy's on his way out there, and he's last thing he remembers is heading down by the road, and something came out of the hedge and bopped him across the side of the head, and knocked him out, totally out. And when he wakes up, he's not only got a headache, but he doesn't have any money.
Yeah.
So go back to the guy, what the hell happened? Well, yeah, we've been having that trouble around the neighborhood here. You know, you got to be careful. People stealing stuff. Really interesting. They used to have parties up there. They had a pool, big pool in the backyard, and they used to have really loud parties every once in a while. But everybody was scared to go up and say anything. They feared they'd get to send the mob down and break your legs or something. I started out, I think I was, of course, once we got out of the service and got through school in Chicago and then settled on Long Island, things settled down for the family. Things were a lot more calm and equitable for everybody. I was a flight engineer for 3 months on the Lockheed Electra, and then life's a learning process. You never stop learning. And I remember one of the old timers telling me early on, he said, because everything's done with a bidding process. When any positions open up for crew positions on different equipment, your vacations, everything's bid. You bid for whatever's available. And he said, it's nice to go to school and do this and do that and the other and train on different equipment. It's just, but if you don't really want something, don't bid it, because if you get it, it's yours, period. And I remember that very well because I bid way out of seniority on a school to go to Copilot school in a Boeing 707, and I went to school, got out of school. School was about 2.5 months down in Texas, and I checked out on the 707 as a co-pilot. Well, I was way out of seniority. I was bottom guy in the seniority list. So of course I was always on reserve, and reserve is just what it said. You know, you're there. If somebody calls in sick, you got to fill their position. And so the thing was, be on reserve, you had to be phone accessible between 5 and 7 every night. So they couldn't call, and you couldn't have your teenage son or daughter on the phone yickety-yakking with one of their friends and tie up the phone. You know, we didn't have cell phones in those days, at least not ones you could afford. And so every night, I mean, there was all these restrictions. Every night between 5, nobody touches the phone. It's Dad's phone. You know, crew schedule might call and they need him for a trip tomorrow. And each month I would try and bid a trip on the 707, and I would get trips like layovers with El Paso in the middle of the summer. You know, you get there and land, go to the hotel, you didn't dare go outside because it was so damn hot. But anyway, I finally got I should say, because we were in it together. We finally got a trip, and it was an all-night freighter trip. And it left Kennedy at something like 11 o'clock at night, and it went Kennedy, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Nashville, Dallas Love Field, getting there about 6 in the morning. And we would go to the hotel, sleep for 4, 5, or 6 hours. You'd get up and walk around a while, get a little exercise, grab some lunch, maybe go back to the hotel, sleep for a while, get up and have dinner, go back and take another nap, and then go to the field about 10, 11 o'clock at night. And coming back, we'd go from Dallas Love to Dallas, Memphis, Washington, Dulles, and then Kennedy. And that was schedule on that was 2 on and 2 off. So you do that 2 days, and then you have 2 days off, and you do it for 2 days. And the thing was that by the time you got used to being up all night long for 2 nights, now you switch back to a regular schedule. And it kind of made a joke out of it, because when I was home, I was off those 2 days I was off, I'd walk into the wall or something because I was half asleep. You know, for 2 nights I've been flying all night long. And so that drove home the advice about be careful what you bid, because if you get something that may be not what you expect. It was interesting.
How long were you a co-pilot on the 707?
I think for about 2 years. Then I went back to the BAC 111 as a co-pilot. And then I went from there to the 727. And I was co-pilot on the 727 until I think about 1983 or 4. Then I upgraded to captain on the 727. And I enjoyed the airplane, especially the shorty, the standard 727. They stretched it. They made a longer airplane. It was actually longer than the 707. Although the 707, I enjoyed flying that. It was especially they had several two engine combinations on the 707. There was the engines that had small inlet doors on the cowl of the engine, so that when you're at high power, these doors would open to allow more air to be sucked into the engine. And then there were engines with the large cowl doors, and the ones with the large cowl doors were a little bit more powerful. And it was a pretty nice airplane to fly, and generally they had pretty good trips. I didn't get into any of the long trips. You know, the American had a routing down in the Pacific. They went from Hawaii on beyond Hawaii into the Pacific area, and I never got into. We'd spend as a family. We'd spend enough time apart when I was in the service or when I was in Vietnam and the Philippines, and so I'd looking more toward the shorter trips. And a lot of the time when I got a little more seniority, I would bid the turnarounds where you go to the airport and fly your trip and then come back same day. You usually worked more days, but you were home every night, which was the important part. So that worked out pretty good. It's a great job. I mean, it's probably the best flying job available. You're out there, nobody looking over your shoulder. I mean, you can't go around crashing airplanes or landing short of the runway because you're not going to last very long. But great working conditions, very good pay and benefits. I thought I did a pretty good job as a crew member, particularly a captain. I had some pretty firm ideas about how things should be run in the airplane. I would brief generally before you went out to the airplane with flight, you'd talk to the #1 flight attendant. And after some experiences I'd seen with other guys, some of the guys I worked with, was very, to me, it was a lot of fun learning from these guys. Sometimes it was funny. I remember one day we had too much fuel on the airplane, and of course, as a co-pilot, like they say, the captain is always a captain. But you will always be charged with making sure you advise the captain. If he's wrong, you tell him he's wrong. And you'll always be held accountable to do that. So they were never supposed to put more fuel on the airplane than, we're not supposed to have. Well, you can have more, but you can run into problems with the older airplanes. They had limited landing weight. So if you took off and you had to land right away, you had to dump fuel. So that's one of the reasons you to be careful about. And it's expensive to ferry fuel, to carry extra fuel you don't need. You're carrying it around. It costs money to do that because the airplane's heavier. So I was insistent I was going to do my job and tell him. I said, Captain, I said, and this guy happened to be this trip. He was a fill-in he was from Dallas. I guess it was towards the end of the month and they were short of people, so they bring this guy in from Dallas. And he spoke with a twang, Hi y'all, we're going to have a great trip. And so I'm telling him it's got too much fuel, and he finally leans over and puts his hand on my shoulder, me this way. And he looks at me, and I'm telling him, we got too much fuel. He says, and just like it is on that page, he says, son, the only time you got too much fuel is when you're on fire. So I said, okay, Captain, just so you know. And
Tell me about, what's probably an incident or the most, something that sticks out on because you've done thousands of flights, right?
Well, yeah, I guess I've got, of airline time, flying the airline, I've probably got about 18,000 hours. And, they were not, like I say, I flew with guys who, once upon a time, the cockpit and the cabin were in the flight department. And then marketing came along, or somebody came along and said, the flight attendants are the direct contact with the public, so they should be in the marketing department. Well, once that change was made, then there was kind of a rivalry thing going. And marketing said, well, this is how we think things should run. And we've got to be able to do certain things. We've got to be able to serve a meal. We've got to be able to accommodate the customers with drink service and so forth and so on, and cater to the customers, and which I understand. I understand all that. But they had to understand that the captain, once the airplane pushes back from the gate, the captain's in charge of the airplane and all its inhabitants. And he's primarily there to, of course, to get them from one place to another, but his primary concern is to do it with safety. And safety is the preeminent thing, because whenever you had a problem with somebody who would challenge your authority, you'd bring up the big S word, safety. And if that didn't do it, then, it was, I had an instance where the dispatch said, well, we don't care about that part. I said, well, forget it, I'm not doing it. And one night they wanted us to ferry an airplane at night from Puerto Rico, empty airplane, from Puerto Rico to Kennedy. And the airplane didn't have any radar. And the dispatch says, well, what do you need radar for? I said, well, and the guy, I hate to be the one to tell you this, I said, but there's thunderstorms out over the ocean. And a big thunderstorm, they go 50, 60,000 feet. And I said, I've been known to lose airplanes in those things, beat them up pretty bad. He said, you'll be able to see them from lightning on. I said, oh, no, there isn't always lightning in thunderstorms. Most of the time, but not always. And I said, you can't see the full extent of a thunderstorm at night. You might just see a part of it. And I'm telling him, all the reasons why I don't think it's a good idea, safety-wise, to do it. And he said, well, he says, you got to do it. And he says, well, I'll tell you what to do. He says, we'll have you fly up with another airplane formation with another airplane. And I said, and of course I went off then and really got upset then. I said, that's even a stupider idea than the one of flying with no radar by myself. And I said, what am I going to do if we're in the clouds? how the hell am I gonna see the other airplane? And, well, you know, you're just making this a different more, it's a nice night out there, weather said it's okay. I said, well, I don't agree. And I think it's a safety issue. So that was it. I hung up. I didn't hear anything back. I fully expected to hear from the chief pilot about it. But my approach to it was, yes, the flight attendants in charge of the cabin, but you know, I remember telling flight attendants that some of the problems they had with people, because people could be really, really ridiculously foolish. And I said, you know, I wouldn't have your job at my pay, because I'd end up punching somebody out or something, some loudmouth. But anyway, I would get the lead flight attendant before the flight, and I'd say, you're in charge of the cabin. If you've got a problem with somebody, you tell me about it. The sooner the better, because if we can solve the problem before we get off, it's much easier to do it on the ground. We can solve the problem before we get off the ground. Once we get in the air, now it's a problem. You know, because do we have to declare an emergency to land to get this jerk off the airplane? Are they a safety threat to the rest of the passengers of the airplane? And I said, you know, whatever it takes, I'll back you. You can take that to the bank. I said, I will back you. So you make a decision. You don't want a passenger on. And if the agent gives you a problem, you come tell me, and we'll settle it right then and there. So I had a pretty good rapport with most of the flight attendants. Later on, we got some of the newer types, and then it got to be some other problems. But I remember a flight going out of, I think it was Puerto Plata, or maybe it was Santo Domingo. It was that country, the Dominican Republic, and this guy and his wife get on the airplane, and he's drunk out of his mind. And they're getting into their seats in the middle of the aisle, and he's cursing around, I guess, in Spanish, giving her a hard time, and then she apparently wasn't moving fast enough for him, so he hauls off and pow, slaps her one. It'll whacks her up against the side of the head. So a flight attendant came up to me and said, hey, Captain, this guy's going to be trouble in the air. We're not even off the ground yet, and he's already beating his wife up. So I said, well, you tell the agent. I said, take him, and if his wife doesn't want to go, take her. If she wants to stay with him, take him off the airplane. He's not going. And so the agent come out and, you know, what's the problem? He'll be okay, settle down. I said, you don't understand. He does not go on this flight. You can get him off, you can sober up, you can go on a later flight, but I'm not allowing him to go on this flight. And that's my final answer. And so they took him off the airplane, and I got a report later on, they got inside the terminal, and she hauled off, turned around, and belted in one leg club. So they must have had a real physical relationship, you know. But that was the thing, you know. Another time I had an airplane that came up from Puerto Rico, and it looked like the town dump, because the people had newspapers all over the floor and food that had been spilled, and there was not much competition at that time going like between New York and Puerto Rico. So, but I think this was a particular time when maybe the airplane got in late or something, and they figured, well, what the hell? We'll just if they'll accept take the airplane, it's just a bunch of Puerto Ricans that are going back down here, or tourists. So what difference does it make? But I mean, the airplane was really crappy. I mean, it's stuff you wouldn't want to travel. I mean, you sit there like looking around all this other people's garbage. So I went out there, you know, you had to deal with the agent on things. There was the primary contact, and I said the airplane needs to be cleaned before. Well, we don't have time. Read my lips. The airplane needs to be cleaned before we go. So we got the airplane cleaned. Another time.
Any in-flight incidents that you had, mechanical, anything?
No, never had. The other preventative, I had a 727 one time. We had a problem with a hydraulic, and we diverted into Miami to get it fixed rather than go all the way up. And we weren't in any difficult situation. We still had backup systems, but once you start losing the redundancy, now you got to start thinking about, well, if something else goes wrong, you're losing more. You don't have the backup anymore. But it's interesting, the reaction of parents. I mean, I tried to the passengers. you try to reassure everybody in a calm,
Yeah.
even voice, you know, this is not an emergency, everything's okay, we're not gonna crash, we're gonna go and land as a precaution, they're gonna fix the airplane, then we're gonna continue our trip. Well, I come out in the terminal, which is a big mistake, I should have gone downstairs the other way. And I'll be, oh, I was like, oh, you know, thank you so much, oh, we're so worried. I was like you were some kind of god or something. But a lot of the, and I noticed this, like coming up, one time we were on a flight coming up out of, I think it was Santo Domingo. We were, or was it Aruba? We were passengers, because there was, Marie and I were on the airplane, and we'd been down there for some good couple days, trip, and, coming up to New York, and the airplane, there was bad weather, and the airplane had a hole. And there was this lady sitting in the 2 rows ahead of us who was terrified of flying at night. She's like my sister. She really, really doesn't like to fly at night. And it got dark, and then we started hitting a little bit of turbulence. The next thing you know, this gal is on her knees in the aisle, and she's praying. I mean, she's really terrified out of her mind. And flight attendants are trying to comfort her and calm her down. So a lot of people are still pretty anxious about flying.
Did you fly any private planes with the family go around? Like, did you ever rent a?
Yeah, we did that once. When we were in Columbus, I joined the Aero Club.
Okay.
And we took a Cessna 172 and put Ray and I and Gene and the dog. And we flew to Connecticut, landed at Bradley Field to attend Ray and Sharon's wedding. My brother was getting married. And that was that was interesting because I was didn't have much time in the airplane, and all you had to do was do 3 takeoff and landing, and you were good to go. So you did all the finer points about when you get up to cruise altitude, you lean out the mixture to save fuel. Well, I didn't do that for the first part of the trip, so I'm looking at the gas gauge and, well, holy shit, we're not going to make it with that. So we landed at Akron, and going into Akron, they're doing all this work around the airport, and they got these great big earth movers there. Well, the perspective as you come in there, I mean, they look like they're really closer than they actually are because they're so big. I mean, they're big Euclids, trucks and earth movers. So we land, and I hear the comment on the back seat, holy cow, I wondered if we were going to make it to the runway. And somebody else said, yeah, I thought we were going to hit one of those big trucks right there. So, but landed, got fuel, and then made the rest of the route. And then it was interesting, we got back.
I need a second, yeah.
Can you listen to this for a second?
We just recorded 2 hours of it.
The year?
I don't know what it is, if I'm just imagining.
It's that air conditioning? The
Yeah,
rattling
what is
of
that?
the,
You guys
Yeah,
can't talk.
huh?
it's that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
What is it?
The air conditioning.
And then going into Bradley, I didn't have an approach chart for wasn't going to be an instrument, and I don't remember that I had an approach chart to Bradley, but I called to find out what runway they were using. The guy in the back says, the one where you're right in the middle of the ILS course. Oops. So I'm sure there was a lot of undesirable comments about that little caper.
All right, we'll get another 45 minutes, and we'll wrap up with what it was like living on the island, raising the kids, and bring us up to current affairs.
Okay,
Thoughts, words of wisdom.
what'd you say?
Thoughts and words of wisdom.
In your perspective from, life, just where you were till now, what you see different in the family, in the world, in the country?
You really don't wanna get on that
No, I
road.
know, we
You really
don't, we don't wanna get into the
You don't wanna get on that road, do you?
we don't wanna get into the no spin zone.
How many sticks has he got?
We'll keep politics out of it. Just a reflection more like.
Oh, I can say it again. In some ways, I mean, technologically, it's a great world the way it's going, and ever improving. Look at the things we can do with technology. But like somebody said, I mean, I've noticed we go out to eat. We eat out a lot, and you go out to eat, and I can't tell you how many. Well, probably tell you a dozen times at least. You go someplace and you're sitting there and you see a family. My mother and a father and a couple of kids come in, young kids, 10, 12, 14 years old, and they're all sitting there at the table, and every one of them's got an iPhone, a phone out, and
Even us, we'll go out with friends, and all of a sudden we'll pause and look around, and our friends will be on their phones instead of like talking to
Oh,
each
listen,
other.
Ma's terrible. Ma used to get so mad at me, and I said, hey, it's my job, I gotta do it. Now she's got one, it's the opposite. It's the same opposite.
well, I'm not saying you shouldn't ever look. I mean, I understand if you get the thing out, you look at it, and you want to check it, and you put it down. But these people, they kind of the waitress goes over to wait person goes over to get their order, and it's like, hey, do you want to eat? What do you hear? Oh yeah, okay, and they put the thing down, and then as soon as the wait person leaves, they pick things up, and it's just an observation. I mean, other times you see people come in, they're having a good time, talking and interacting, but there's a lot to be said about the anonymity and the detachment of the internet. I mean, you can get on there and anybody can say anything and nobody knows who it is. So.
All right, so I think we end this, take us through your last flight.
Well, you know as much about that as I do.
I know, but that's what I think your last
Yeah, it was,
flight didn't take us.
Well, it was some interesting events leading up to that too, kind of interesting. Our last flight was on the 20th of September, 21st to say, yeah. Well, I went out on the 20th, came back on the 21st because I retired on the 22nd.
Of what year?
1994. And that month I had Aruba layover. So we got on the airplane at Kennedy, and American had at least at Kennedy it was kind of an unwritten policy because I never found it anywhere in the policy manuals, but they had a policy that on a captain's last trip he would be allowed to take family members with him. Now I don't know if there was a reasonable limit or what. I mean, some of the guys had 5 or 6 or 7 kids. I don't know if they let all of them go, depending on what the availability of the seats were. But Aruba was a pretty heavily traveled. Usually the airplanes were pretty full. Well, that day, I brought Maria to the airport. I had spoken with previously with the person in the office who was supposed to coordinate with the reservations department and make sure that she was able to get on the airplane. Well, we get to the gate, and I stopped to talk to the agent, and I introduced myself and informed her that it was my retirement trip, and that my wife was with me, and I want to make sure she's going to get on the airplane. And the answer I got, well, Captain, the airplane's full. And it kind of went downhill from there. So fortunately, I had a heads-up co-pilot working with me, and he got on the radio and called the office and had him phone patch to the office. So there at LaGuardia, and said, "Hey, we got a situation over here where the captain's wife is here to go on him. It's his last trip, and the agent won't put her on." So they came back and said, "Put her in the cockpit." And so the FAA rules that nobody is supposed to be in a cockpit except other crew members or cabin crew or something, or FAA people. And so she got to ride down to Aruba in the cockpit and enjoyed it, I guess. And you know, well, we get down there and I'm getting off I walk out of the cockpit, getting off the airplane, and up the aisle come Joe and Gene. And, you know, what do you think? Well, I was there at Kennedy. I didn't see them there. How the hell did they get on the airplane? Well, they had already arrived you and Gene had already arrived at Aruba, and he sweet talked his way back out onto the flight line so they get on the airplane and greet us as we were getting off the airplane. So, and then we spent the layover there and went swimming, and then went out and ate and all of that, and had a good time coming back because the first class was empty basically. His coach was fairly full, but first class, I think there was a couple of dead-ending crew members. Then there was you and Gene and Donna and Marie, and Steve didn't make it. Steve or Greg didn't make it. And we came back to Kennedy, and then they have a little cake and coffee kind of thing at the office there for you. And everybody has a cup of coffee and a piece of cake and goes home. Hey, it was, you know, I wish that the age 60 rule had been changed before. I would have liked to go on a couple more years. It would have done a lot for my retirement balance. But it was a good experience. It was good. I mean, I enjoyed doing it, and basically back to my original premise. That's all I ever wanted to do was fly airplanes. So I got to do what there's not a lot of people, or there's not an overabundance of people that can say that. You know, I'm doing something that I really like doing, or really love doing. They get out of your job well, you know, some pay is good, and and I'm only going to do it for this period of time to get to where I want to go there or something, or do something else. And you meet a lot of great people. I worked with a lot of people. I worked with some real jerks, but I worked with one guy. He was of Italian descent, and had was very temperamental, and would tend to fly off the handle. I got along with him. I don't know if it was because I was of Italian descent also, but he kind of a unpredictable guy, and I say that in the sense that we're taking off, I think, out of Tucson one day on a fully loaded 727, stretch 727. And it's always, you know, when you're operating the airplane at up near the limits, it's always some concern, because in the back of your mind you're thinking about, well, what if we lose an engine? And on takeoff, you know, after V1, which is your go, no-go point speed. And so we're charging down the runway, and I'm sitting there and calling off the speeds and everything, and he hollers, "Oh, you got it! And I don't know what the hell's going on. When he's telling me, I got it, so I got my hand up on the throttle, I got a hold of the control wheel, and I'm trying to look out and see what the hell is going on, watching and see if he sees something. He hasn't told me that something's wrong. It was probably after V1, because otherwise, if there was a real problem, he should have aborted. So I don't know what, you know, if he's having a heart attack or shit his pants or what. And so I'm pull the airplane up here and get the gear up, clean the airplane up a little bit, and everything kind of settled down. I know, guys, what the hell's going on? Well, and he never specified why he did it. I always thought it was some kind of a test, I guess. I don't know. But that's probably the dumbest thing you could do at that point. Because if the guy's really not, and I'm not saying that, you know, nobody else could have done what I did. I'm just saying, if it's somehow it gets screwed up in the transfer of the control, why? You know, what's that all about? But,
all right, so now, here's the part you want to go. Now, you have 4 children.
mm-hmm.
I don't even know, maybe you know how many grandchildren.
9.
You got great-grandchildren.
Yep. 2.
Okay. Is that it? Great-grandchildren's nothing past that, right? I think we're there, but now, so with all that in perspective, looking back at all you created,
Well, I think I've been extremely fortunate. I went through a period of flying combat. Well, it wasn't air-to-air combat. It wasn't somebody there in another airplane trying to shoot me down. But when somebody's shooting at you, it's combat. And so I came through that unscathed, basically. I didn't even get a Purple Heart for that when I hit my airplane. You know, the airplane got wounded, but the airplane doesn't get a Purple Heart. You got to get wounded to get a Purple Heart. And so I feel like I've been fortunate. Would I have done some things differently? Maybe. I was one of the things I did. It was I thought one of the best things I did was marrying Marie. She's an only child, but you'd never know it. She never acted like she was spoiled or had to have her way with this, that, or the other. She gladly took on the job of raising the kids while I was around, you know, flying to places like St. Martin and overnight over there and things like that. Sometimes wintertime would get a little testy because I'd go someplace and lay in the sun all afternoon after flying the trip down there, and then come home and she'd say, "Oh, how was your trip?" "Oh, the sun was terrible." So I'd get a cold supper that night or something. But I guess maybe it's the same thing you hear from parents, the changing culture. I think our young people got a more difficult world to compete in. I think sometimes the people in power, i.e. the politicians, don't give the voters the credit that they deserve. They think they're stupid. Personally, in our own family, we're very proud of Gene. Steve has done well with his family, relatively speaking. Greg, I don't know what the problem is there since Kathy died. Seems like the relationship, for whatever reason, is kind of strained, and it is what it is, you know. Of course, Donna's got her own demons to contend with, but I kind of look back and look at the children, and when you see them do things, and you say, well, I hope I had some part in helping you gain the knowledge and the experience and the wisdom to make the choice you did. Like I say, could have done some things differently, probably. But it's still a good life, essentially. And you see, and you know, Marie breaks my heart because you know, 10, 15 years ago she was run rings around people that were half her age, and she used to delight her, and I would get a real kick out of it. We'd get down to some place like Steinmeier, or what, it wasn't Steinmeier then, but Bell's or something, and she'd love to go around and look at everything, and she might pick up some things and bring them home, and then 2 days later she'd take them back. But she used to love to just go around and shop and look around and just look. You know, that's great. That's wonderful. You know, here, I mean, you work so hard, raising your family and everything. I thought, well, here's now, and you know, that's like before she ever got where it would be too risky for her to be on her feet running around the kitchen trying to cook. I felt, I retired, why shouldn't she be retired? And I hear other women, since we live in an over 55 community, and I hear other women say that, like particularly one of them, she says, I'm so damn tired of cooking. And she's 80 years old, and she's been cooking since they got married. And so we started that a long time ago, that you know, yeah, we eat home occasionally. I'll try and help her, especially now when she's got stability problems or balance problems. But even before that became an issue, try and do things so that we're more on an equal footing, kind of thing. And when you say, I'm not saying I'm retired, we're retired, both of us. So what else can I say? I hope that this thing that we're doing, it's a wonderful idea. I think it, as you said, it'll be something for the kids later on to look at.
If you were, you know, one of the things I wanted to get out, Dad, was if you were to look at Joe, right, and say, hey, listen, you know, the things that you know, the wisdom that you gain, whether it's about career or family, like any of the grandchildren or great-grandchildren at some point when they look at this, that there's something that's powerful in what the words that you have, that you would say to them, that say, hey, listen, from my experiences, whether it's love for your spouse, love for your kids, or love for life in itself, whatever, I mean, what comes to your mind? Well, you know, like, you know, you've probably said a lot of those things, I would imagine, to your kids, you know, because, you know, I know I have with Joe what I think of it. But if you were talking to the grandkids, that you haven't had those words or those moments with, like you have had with your children, what would you tell them? Like firsthand, so it's not the parents saying, well, I remember when my father told me this.
Yeah.
You know, this is great.
Well, I do remember some of the things that we tried to instill in our children. And it was, you were talking earlier about, you know, how the kids turned out because the father was a drunk, a fall down drunk kind of thing. Well, it's sort of similar in this. And my father, I remember my father telling me, he says, don't lie to me. He says, because once you lie, after that, how can I believe you? And so I always try to tell the kids, yeah, maybe I'm a little short-tempered at times, but lying's not the way to go. You know, be upfront and speak the truth. And all above all, you know, don't lie to yourself. And so, and the other thing I tried to, one of the major tenets in our family, and I don't know how successful, it doesn't appear to have been terribly successful, was that you'll never, no one will ever be closer to you than your brothers and your sisters. You know, you're blood related. So don't let it turn. I mean, it's great to have friends and close friends and best buddies and best friends forever and all that kind of thing, but it should be, your family should be at the top of the list of important things in your life, and maintaining that status. It's this things in general. I have, as I've aged, I have a lot more appreciation now for nature and the things around us, for other people perhaps. Everybody's out there trying to get along, just get from here to there. And I'm a great believer in congratulate or praise in public, but criticize in private. Nobody wants to be standing in the middle of the room and with half a dozen other people in the room, or even one other person in the room, and have somebody tell them what a jerk they are. It may be true, but you know, it's not the time and place to do it. So I think the world needs a lot more civility. The culture, I should say, needs a lot more civility. And just, you know, essentially be true to yourself and those around you. And you may not think that you make a difference, but you do.
Joe, Brian, you got any follow-up questions?
Give me 5 minutes after the camera shut off, I'll do this one.
Well, we can always add on later, I guess.
We could do a selfie and send it to.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, just, that was real good, Dad, that whole part, that, just trying to think, it's, so to me, it's such good stuff, I'm trying to make sure I don't forget anything. What do you got, Joe?
You got any questions, Joey? Throw them out.
I don't know that I do.
Dad, you did a good job
Yeah.
of just like recapping, bringing it all together, and any subject we went to.
I mean, we've been filming people I've been filming people for the last month, like, on and
Yeah.
off. You're probably the easiest interview that I've seen. I mean, everything was
Right.
really natural, and I don't know. It was,
Because I've done 2 of these
Thank
for
you.
work, like, just tell me about IBS. Well, I'm a mess. You're like, just flows right.
Yeah, I can attest to that.
Yeah. Okay, well, we didn't have to go that.
Well, thank you.
I have a question, maybe something that you can expand on a little bit, is early on in the conversation, and maybe it's something that everybody else in the family already knows and I just don't, but you talked about, like, your mom went to school with you, and when your headmaster, whoever it was, told you to come back because you didn't go to the dance class, she came back with you, and how she had a lot of good wisdom to put into your life, but you didn't say too much about your dad. Did he pass away at a young age, or was he around, or?
No, my dad was old. Didn't get married till he was 33. He worked hard all his life. He started out when he came to this country from Italy, working on a railroad, and worked in what is now, I think, EIS brake parts in New Britain or Meriden, Connecticut. The interesting story about that, I got it. It's funny. Remind me to come back to that. And now my mother, here's a contrast, if you will. My mother was a person who would tell you something the first time, and she'll tell you the second time, like when we were kids, like, stop. I remember one incident. Ray and I we had twin beds, side by side in the bedroom, and we were jumping up and down on the beds, and she was out in the kitchen, and this is the apartment we lived in Middletown over an auto parts store, the south end of Middletown. And we were jumping up and down on the beds, there's a couple of young boys being boys, and she said, stop that jumping on the beds. We stopped for 20 seconds or something, then we started again, giggling and jumping again, how it goes. And so that happened. Like I said, my mother would tell you the first time, she'd tell you the second time, and if it was your lucky day, she'd tell you the third time. After that, the stuff hit the fan. Because she was out in the kitchen, and I could close my eyes and I can remember, she had one of these old washers that went chung, 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 with the agitator went back and forth, like didn't spin like it does now, like chung, chung, chung. And I remember we're jumping up and down, and chung, chung, and all of a sudden it got quiet. And my brother, being smarter than me, he's so shit, so he real quick, jumps off the bed and runs into my mother and father's bedroom and gets under the bed because he knew what was coming. Well, she comes in and she comes over to me, and of course her way of punishment was physical. I told you to stop, you pow! She whacks me. Whoa, you want? I told you to stop, you want? Pow! And so she worked me over a couple of slaps there, good slaps, and she's, where's your brother? Oh, I don't know, crying. So she, Raymond! And she goes over and he's on the bed. She said, Raymond, come out of that bed. I said, no, Ma, come out of that bed, Raymond. Come out of here. And he knew what he was going to get if he did. So she became so upset, she went and got a dust mop. And she's trying to push him out from under the bed. And he grabs him up and pulls it out of her hand. Well, before she was upset, now she's enraged. She's like the bull with the wet flame. Raymond, what are you doing? I'm going to kill you. No, Ma. But it's that I remember that part. Now, see, my father, the only time he ever laid a hand, he never laid a hand on me. He booted me in the backside for it. I can't remember what it was for, but he booted me with the side of his foot. But he would say something to you, and he would say it in a serious vent, and you would know he meant business. But my mother was the main disciplinarian in the family, and mean, I never felt like he didn't love me or anything, but I always felt like he was working too hard. He was older and didn't come when I played sports in high school. He couldn't find the time to come to the games, and my mother couldn't either. They're both working, so I never sensed any lack of concern here or lack of love, and they certainly tried to do everything they could to help me further my career and school and everything.
How about any, that was good, I had on my list here for any situations with you and your brother or sister, so heard a little situation with your brother, you got any stories like that?
Well, I about knocked his brains out one day.
Yeah.
We were out in the front yard there at Greystone, and I had a bat, and I was picking up stones and whacking the stones. And for some reason, he walked up behind me over here. I didn't know he was there, and I threw the stone. I came around and hit him right in the forehead with the edge of the bat. So by the time I turned and looked at him, he's lying on the ground. He's already got a goose egg coming. I thought his head would explode. I run inside screaming at my mother. Of course, we get him and throw him in the car and rush to the hospital. And they put cold compresses on it, and I don't know whether even back then if they did x-ray or anything to see. I guess the doctor felt around, but that scared me pretty badly. Other things that we're all.
With Lucille?
No, she was much younger. Never really had things happen with Lucille too much. Two other things I remember happening. One was I was the oldest one, so I got to take care of the other two younger ones, and we were still living over the auto parts store in Middletown at the time, and Mom and Dad were downstairs working. I was taking care of, and Lucille was still in diapers at that time, so I was expected to change her diaper when it needed to be done. So I changed her diaper this one time, and I got her there holding it on. I got this dirty diaper in my hands. I said to my brother, I said, "Here, take this and put it in the bathroom." And he says, "No." And I'm telling you, take this and put it in the bathroom. No, so I threw it at him. He put it out. So he can remember that. And the other thing that happened with Ray that he remembers, he'll never forget. We had seen a mummy movie. One of the early ones, and they were pretty scary, especially for a younger kid. And where the house is now at Greystone, we were living in what's now Greystone. The house that Lucille is in now, my parents had for a while, was just a garage, the big abandoned garage. And so I concocted this story that my mother wanted him to go get something up in the garage and bring it down to the house. So, and it was right around dusk. So he went up, took a flashlight, went up to the garage, and got whatever he was supposed to get. Meanwhile, I went outside and I hid behind the bushes. So when he comes sauntering back from the garage with whatever he had, I came out of the bushes. My arm like this in one hand, I'm dragging one foot like a mummy. So he dropped whatever he had in the flashlight, takes off for the house, and he barely make it up the front stairs. His feet are going so fast. And of course my mother hears all the commotion. She comes out. He's so terrified, out of breath, he can't even tell her what the hell's going on. I thought I killed him. I thought he was going to have a heart attack. But sometimes you talk to Ray, ask him about the mummy experience, and he'll tell you it's still pretty vivid in his memory. But I had to hide out after that, because when she found out what was going on, she was after my hide. We used to keep things hopping.
Is that time out?
Yeah, that one's full.
Okay. That was good.
Yeah, I appreciate that you're doing it. I think it'll be great to have.
Do you think we missed anything? Joe? I think we hit. I hit everything I had on my pad.
I think that's the major parts.
Yeah, it's 5 hours of stuff we didn't have yesterday.
Yeah.
Well, I appreciate you guys going to the trouble. I mean, like, when it was first explained, and Joe explained this to me, it's pretty hard to say no to a deal like that, you know, it's a,
I know, it makes me wish that we would have been able to do it for my grandma before she passed away.
Yeah.
But I'm like, well, she has a living brother. I kind of want to go to Michigan and see if I can get him on record.
You know how this came about? After all the Band of Brothers and all that stuff, it started on the Vietnam thing, you know, I mean, we added more to this one, but
the old club, the big thing at the old club was, the steaks that thick from Australian steaks.
yeah.
And French fries. That was generally the meal. I mean, you could eat at the Air Force mess, which we did sometimes. We had an early mission, and the old club wasn't open yet. But I mean, I had, and that's where I talked to that artillery captain, or you talk to some of the infantrymen you run into. There's all the difference in the world. I mean, I had it good, and I only got shot at that I know of. Probably other times that they missed me, but that one time when I hit the airplane. So I mean. It was like guys going out and look at now in Afghanistan and Iraq, and these guys, you got these improved devices, explosive devices that they're stepping on, and they can't seem to solve the problem with that. It's a whole different thing with with war, with battle now, and being on the ground. It's like Tyler thought he wanted to be a helicopter pilot, and once in a while we'd talk a little bit about it, and I said, well, I don't know everything. I said, but I have learned a few things along the way. I said, and the two things I'll tell you is, you want to enlist, I says, life is, trust me, I'm using the right words, life is infinitely better as an officer than it is as an enlisted. Now, not to say enlisted men or anything, because enlisted men are what make the services work. Not the officers. And I said, life is better as an officer, and you may have gotten to this mindset playing computer games, and when the computer game's over and everybody's dead, you press a button and the game starts over again. I said, but if you take a round between the eyes, you're done. That's it. No more. No reset button. And I said, if you really want to be a helicopter pilot and you want to look to the future and have it pay off for you to some extent, try to get yourself an appointment to the Coast Guard Academy. Learn how to fly a helicopter with the Coast Guard, because they fly helicopters under the worst imaginable conditions other than war. They're out there rescuing people in storms and all the rest of it. And I said, you come out of there with that kind of experience resume, you should be able to get a job flying a helicopter anywhere. I don't know where that went, but maybe it'll happen sometime in the future.
All right.
Pool time?
Full time. You taking the challenge, Joe?
Yeah.
We gotta do the challenge. Okay.
Should I take this chair out?
Yeah.